Okay, everyone. Good morning. We'll call the meeting to order. Council is conducting this meeting in person via conference call according to Municipal Government Act Section 199. Council chambers is open for public attendance in person. However, councilors and members of the public may still join meetings remotely using our current teleconference process. Please note this meeting is being recorded and may be uploaded to our website and our social media. To eliminate background noise, please mute your phone during the meeting. We ask that all attendees mute their devices to reduce disruptions during the meeting. Everyone has the right to be present at council meetings and council committee meetings. Any attendees that are considered disruptive to the progression of this meeting may be removed at the discretion of the chair as per Municipal Government Act Section 198. We thank you for your cooperation and understanding. ReveLink is anybody participating remotely? Sorry. Okay, so I don't have to read that part, but ReveLink sends her regrets. She has some stuff to do in Nisku with RMA, I believe. With that, we have an agenda in front of us. Is there any additions, deletions, or changes? Seeing none, a motion to approve the agenda, please. Councilor Bigger.
So moved.
Motion on the floor. Any discussion? Are we using eScribe for voting? No, so it's just a regular way to vote with your arm. Get the exercise. All in favor? That's carried. We'll move on to 2.21, 2024 Assessment 101 presentation. We have a very excited staff member about taxes to talk to us. Go ahead, Dennis.
Good morning, Council and Deputy Reeve. It is a pleasure and honor to be able to present in front of you today. My goal of this presentation is to expand your knowledge and understanding of the assessment process. At any time during the presentation, don't hesitate if you have a question. I'd rather you ask it then than wait until the end of the presentation. If it's okay, Mr. Chairman, I'm fairly flexible in how we do this presentation.
Absolutely. If there's any questions, try to get my attention for the chair to recognize you so you can speak. And if I don't see you, wave your hand loudly or throw something at me, and that's fine.
And just to make the presentation a little more interesting, we'll have a little knowledge test at the end of the presentation. There's only going to be 4 questions, and we'll see how you do. So on paper, pardon me?
Knowledge test first.
Well, sure, I could ask them now if you're ready. If you've read the material, the answers are in the material, so it's sort of like an open book test. Okay, well then we'll start the presentation here. So to start with, I want to dispel some misconceptions that the public may have. That bottom's presentation is not how I view your assessment unless your property resembles that. I'm more like the how you view the assessment or your buyer, the top 2. Ultimately, for residentially speaking, we're trying to reflect what the average market value of the property is. So, you know, any factors that impact market value, such as basement finish, type, square footage of the house is the big component, year built, those kind of things. We look at the same factors that you do. I'm not sure if any of you noticed yet, well, we sent out what we call requests for information forms. We're getting ready for our reinspection cycle. We're working in range 23 this year. So anybody who lives in range 23 that has a single residence will get a request for information form. I think this will be on the update coming in. Pardon me?
Is range 23?
Range 23 would be along highway, just east of Highway 20. Well, through around Rockyford down to just east of Eagle Lake, just the west side of the glacier. And I do have a picture of
Dennis, could you maybe explain for the public too that how you do like you go around the county and certain areas get picked every year, like you're always reassessing, like a 5-year cycle or something, isn't it?
Exactly. We're on a 5-year cycle, so we try to inspect a property once every 5 years. We usually around 20% of the property base we inspect. And about 3 years ago, we started on using this request for information form. We send it out to the ratepayers in that given area. It's a 2-pager, fairly easy questions they can answer. They have the ability to either submit the answers online, they could email, they could drop a phone in, or they could use the snail mail too if choose. They're fairly straightforward questions. We only send them to the property owners that have one residence. So if you have multiple residents, because of the potential confusion factor on which house you're answering the questions for, those ones we still proceed with site inspections. Even if we get a response from the ratepayer on this request for information form, we still proceed with site inspections. We want to update our photos. That's a valuable tool in our assessment base, in our assessment information. And we spot check just to ensure that the information that is self-reported, if you will, is actually accurate information. Occasionally, we still find the odd building without a permit. It's very limited, but could be a garage. It's been quite a while since I found a house. I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago. We do find the odd trailer sometimes, or sometimes they've replaced the trailer with a newer one. And so usually that's very limited, very minute situations. But this reinspection cycle is mandated by the Municipal Affairs Assessment Services branch. Because the goal is this, to ensure that we have accurate data of your property in order to produce a fair and equitable assessment. Likewise, we find situations where the house is really rough shape. It's almost barely habitable, or the valuation has decreased quite a bit. So we want to recognize that. We just don't want to recognize the increases. We want to recognize any change on the property. So I think this is a little, I understand this is Brian's little getaway when he's on holidays. I'm not sure if this is the exact location, but this is what I heard. So on page 6 of the agenda items, I'm going to go through some of the key definitions in the assessment classes for now. And these definitions are legislated, and they are within Section 297 of the Municipal Government Act. And there's some expansion of the definitions within the matters relating to assessment taxation regulation, commonly referred to in the assessment world as MRAT. It's a fairly common term that we use. So actually, in addition to the assessment classes, pretty much everything that, as a practicing assessor province-wide, we're on the same provincial legislation, where we have a definition for market value, we have classes of assessment. There's everything is pretty much legislated how we perform the assessment through the Municipal Government Act. So whether you're in Grand Prairie or you're in Wheatland County, the only variance in that obviously is the market value for the locality you're in. But the concept of what data is used to establish that market value is the same. Or if it's a regulated valuation, like on a farmland property, or like farmland itself, or on oil field situations, the separators, the dehydes, machinery, equipment components. So residential actually is a default class. It's technically in the MGA, there isn't a specific definition for it. If the assessor hasn't classed the property as either farmland, residential, non-residential, then it goes to residential. The only time that sort of really kicks into play is if you have a vacant parcel in a hamlet. If it's zoned residential, it would be assessed as vacant residential. Whereas if it's zoned non-residential, some sort of commercial entity, it would be classed as non-residential. So typically a residence is residential class, but you could have an acreage with just a garage on there, and he's not using that as a farm building, so it's a residential class. You could have the same idea with a shop. Class 2 is non-residential. So there's some specific terms for certain types of non-residential, but in general terms, for a commerce or industry takes place on the property. It's assessed at market value, same concept as the residential. And even if there isn't a development permit for that resident or non-residential use, if we see indication signage, multiple vehicles and they're running a repair shop or something, we can assess it without the legislative authority from the zoning application, if you will. Was there a question? Or?
Yeah, you mentioned that there's a parcel of land and it just has like a garage on it. And it just has a garage on it? How do you assess that?
So we look at the use of the property. If it's 160 acres and that garage is storing their farm equipment, we probably wouldn't even assess that. It'd be a farm building. But if it's a 10-acre parcel and that garage appears to be used for just personal use, and we would try to contact them obviously and confirm, but sometimes we have to do just visual inspections. If we see that's the only parcel that they own, the likelihood of them using that for a farm operation, if we see that the yard site is shelter belt, there's really no farming operation going on there, we would most likely have that as residential assessment class. And then as soon as we have a residential assessment class on the building, at minimum, we have to assess a 3-acre hypothetical site, or we look at the use of the parcel. And if the parcel, say, is 5 acres and it appears there's no farming operation, then we go the entire parcel at market value residential class.
Interesting. Didn't know that.
So some, basic examples of non-residential is a little bit of complicated classification because it includes some subclasses under it that I don't perform the assessment for. The ones that I do is the basic non-residential. So like if you have a mom and pa auto repair shop, you have a high throughput elevator, the buildings, the office administration and the buildings there that aren't used in the actual movement of the grain or blending of the grain, those are deemed non-residential. There's because I'm still a delegate assessor, I perform the assessment also for the designated industrial property. And so and we'll see this later in the slide, but at a compressor station, you have a building that houses the compressor. The building is non-residential. The compressor is machinery equipment. Now, one subclass of non-residential is linear assessment. The provincial assessor performs this assessment, and it typically straddles many municipalities. Like pipelines is a good example, power lines, but there can be some specific type linear wells, communication towers, electric power cable systems, and railways and other linear assessment. It actually used to be a non-residential assessment, but about 5 years ago, it got reclassed as linear assessment. So linear assessment is properties, just for a little bit of background, they're assessed at a regulated rate. And the reason that is they're not properties that typically sell on the open market and you can establish a market value like you can for a residence. A pipeline, if it sells, there's a lot of external factors that impact the value of that pipeline. And that's why you can't easily establish market value for a pipeline or a well. So there's a prescribed legislated rate in the linear assessment manual. And it's a fairly, it's kind of a A times B times C calculation. You have to know the size of the pipeline or the well, the length or diameter, and then there's a regulated rate based on the different size and diameters of that. And then if the pipeline is marginal or more so for the well, if it's marginal production, then there's some further reduction to reduce the value of it because it's not a normal producing well, if you will. Or if a pipeline has marginal production on it, it gets some adjustments as well. Class 3, you're probably most familiar. You see this when you drive anywhere. Farmland exists all over the county. The technical definition of that, and I've sort of put this a little more in layman's term, but you have to be raising production and sale of agricultural products. and it's lands to, and they actually have more technical terms, but you have to physically be producing either trees, bees, fish, crops, forage, birds, livestock, sod. Farmland's assessed at a regulated rate. The provincial base rate currently is set at a very low value at 350 an acre, and that's if it's 100% land. In the county, our best land is on the west side. It's probably like Cheadle area, south of there, north of there, and it's probably around that 95%. So to give you an example, if it was 100% farmland, it'd be assessed at 58,000. Because you take 350 times 160, whereas the average farmland you'll see later in the presentation, like if we did a computed average, we're about 28,000. So we're at roughly 50% of that 350 an acre. Then the last class in the assessment realm is machinery and equipment. And that's essentially means, just as it states, materials, devices, fittings, installations, or apparatuses that are used in the manufacturing or processing of a product. They're assessed at regulated rates. Same concept as linear. The big chunk of our machinery equipment is in the oil field sector. It's the separator at a well site. It's a compressor at a gas plant, those kind of things. Machine equipment does get a bit of a preferential assessment treatment in the sense that when it's new, its valuation is about 58% of its sort of assessable cost, if you will. It gets immediate 25% depreciation. That's a statutory stipulation, and it's assessed at a statutory level of 77%. So if you had $100,000 or say 100 million, well, let's use simple $100,000 machine equipment item, it'd be assessed at 58,000 because of those two calculations that are factored in, 0.75 times 0.77. So the non-dip machine equipment would be grain handling installations. We have some of the Hutterite colonies have either wood cabinet making businesses where they actually cut the wood for the cabinets or the countertops. So that those commercial saws they use for that is machining equipment. And then, you know, the bigger chunk of our machine equipment you'll see shortly here is the separators and compressors and the plant site equipment.
Before we go on, I had some questions on the farming thing because I get to ask this because I have a CFO in my area and there's been upgrades. People always ask me, like, if they do a biodigester, the abattoir, things like that, how is that taxed versus in the agricultural realm? Because I get asked it all the time. So it's just easier to ask it here because some of that would be M&E, I think, and some would be. So
I was just going to ask you, what do you think, based on what you heard, what do you think that would be?
I would think the farmland is farmland, whatever. The CFO itself.
CFO confined feeding operation?
Yeah, like the office would be M&E, I would think.
No, actually the office, anything associated with a confined feeding operation is still a farm operation. There's no assessment place now, but once you take it past the growing state and you start processing the livestock or the grain or then you're no longer in the farm operation and you're in the combination of machine equipment and non-residential. So like a bio digester, I'm pretty sure that is a process. It's making a product that is going to be saleable per se. So like even in the if you take it back to a more basic situation, you grow a carrot and you package that carrot. If you do the packaging on your site, that's already getting into non-residential assessment. If you just wash it and package it, there's no M&E there. But if you slice that carrot or you chop up that carrot and make soup, then if you do that on site, then the equipment that's used to either slice or make the soup is machine equipment. Same concept with wheat. You grow the wheat and you sell it bulk to wherever, that's a farm operation. But if you grind the wheat down, change the nature and form of the product, that's machine equipment.
So on one thing, you talked about an elevator, and if someone had an elevator, their office there would be not farm, correct?
Yeah,
So
well.
how is that different than the CFO?
So,
Is this an office?
like the commercial type, like Agrium or, I mean, Agricor or UGG or those are a combination of non-residential machinery equipment. There really is very little machinery equipment in there because they may dry the grain, so they have a dryer. But there is again, a document was created several years ago because those are a little bit, they have a grain handling facility that they have little workhouse bins that they use to sort of blend different moisture content of grain to get a finished moisture content of grain. And so they're not really changing the product, but there is a negotiated document through municipal affairs that says you have to allocate a percentage of the grain handling facility as machine equipment based on the ratio of the small working bins as a ratio of the large storage bins. So the large storage bins are non-residential, the small working bins and a percentage of the leg is machinery equipment. But the dryer, and if there's a separator, screener of some sort, that would be all M&E. But there's some old elevators, like in Rosebud and Chancellor, that one farmer bought that. He only uses it to store his own grain. He doesn't have the ability, he's actually, when he purchased that, he signed an agreement he could not use that as an active elevator. So he can only store his own grain. So that's treated no different than a grain bin on Mr. Farmer's land. It's a farm building. It's exempt from assessment and taxation.
Just through the chair, just for further clarity. So Deputy Reeve Clausen's question about the abattoir itself. So any additional cattle that are being raised on that property, all farmland, no change in assessment. Any facilities that are built or machinery and equipment that are used in the processing of cattle for a saleable product would be assessed as M&E or non-residential, depending on the building or equipment used.
Yeah, and I don't want to necessarily tie that saleable product because they can process something and then it may be used into further down the food chain, if you will. But once you start getting past the growing stage and you start doing something with your livestock, the abattoir or with chickens or whatever, if you do it on site, if you just are that it comes into the realm of combination machine equipment and non-residential.
And just to further that a little bit, because we have lots of colonies, and it's just for people so they know, because I get asked this all the time, all that kind of processing stuff that gets done on site is treated the same way. There is no exemption for this.
Well, that complicates a little bit because if they're processing for their own purpose and not selling, that portion is deemed farm. But the portion that is for sale, if you will, or for commercial activity, that portion is non-residential. So we do our best to try to establish what that ratio is in discussion with them. I know north of Rocky Ford, there's a large facility built on one of the colonies that it was majority is for off sales. So we have, I think, like 70–80% combination of non-residential or machinery equipment.
Just follow up on the abattoir. Everything that goes into that abattoir is the machinery and equipment. But the land that abattoir sits on, is that still agricultural or is that getting
It's not
industrial?
Non-residential.
Non-residential?
Yeah.
And then how do you set that
At market value.
market value? Okay.
And it's area and use.
Look at Mike's, sorry.
It's area and use. So we look at the footprint to house that building, any parking around the building and so on. And usually it would be minimum 1 acre site and upwards depending on the size of the facility. And we take that out of the farmland valuation, put it in non-residential.
Go ahead, Don.
Yeah, can we talk about wind and solar? So solar is under what class?
What do you think it is?
I was hoping it was linear.
It is.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay. So if it's linear,
The majority of it is linear.
and so what would happen if, okay, now you put sheep underneath that? Can they claim that against that?
Yeah, that's been a recent topic come up. We actually there was a presentation, I was at a CPTA, Canadian Property Tax Association conference last week. And I'm trying to remember the term to use for that. That is starting to sort of muddy the waters as to how the assessment is treated on that. Currently, majority of the solar farms, like we have one in the county here, just east here a little bit, where the nitrogen or ferrous gas, a little bit west of there. And I think it's like the quarter is 160 acres, but about 140 some acres is the footprint of where the solar panels sit. They don't do anything underneath that, to my knowledge, as of yet. That whole 140 acres is assessed at market value. It's a part of the designated industrial property, but I, as a delegate, still do that. The fencing around that is again non-residential, and then there's a little maintenance building that is non-residential. The solar panels and the substructure for the panels, that's part of the linear assessment under the power generation subcategory of linear assessment.
And so what happens with wind? So usually linear is this way, wind is this way. Did they go that?
Same thing, same concept, yeah.
Good.
The only thing is the site area for the turbines or the towers is quite a bit smaller, like maybe 1 acre per tower, maybe even less, because we account for the driveway plus the teardrop going around the tower, and so it's roughly 1 acre. And then they would, again, usually they have a maintenance shop somewheres and fencing around that, so that, and a site area for that. So that's all non-residential, but it's designated industrial property, non-residential.
And this is probably a question for Brian, but so what happens, because it's a leased land, so the tax bill goes to the owner of the land, right?
On which one?
On solar?
No. Once it's linear property, the assessment actually goes to the leasee.
Oh, it does?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And one thing to be aware of, currently, any power generation is exempt from paying education tax. It's a bit of incentive the province brought in several years ago, and they're still carrying that forward. I'm not sure how long, but whether you're solar, wind, or natural gas, or whatever way you produce the power, it's currently exempt from education funding or tax funding, if you will.
What happens if you've got solar on your building or even your house? Does that, do you assess that as improvement, or how do you assess that?
Right now, we're sort of just gathering the information on those properties because we're not sure how that impacts the market value. And it's been a discussion at conferences, assessors conference. You could put because there's sort of different classifications of power generation. There's micro generation, where what you produce you would consume, but these little ones that are put on your rooftop or even on this, you set a little solar panel array, they cost anywhere from 20 to 80,000. We're not sure, like some of them have the ability, if the individual sells that, he could take that with him and move it to the next location. A lot of them probably a little more permanent, they could stay on site. When we do the valuation of the land, we reflect the valuation for services to the land, power, water, gas, septic. That valuation is about $80,000, and I think the power component is, don't quote me on this, but it's around 20,000, maybe a little less. We're not sure that these solar arrays achieve more in the marketplace. Like if you built that, you spent 60,000 on it. Are you going to be able to sell your property for an extra 60,000 on that? It's still a relatively new type of situation. And right now I haven't been doing any direct adjustment for that. I've been inventorying those, put a narrative code on them. And when we run our sales, we try to see if there's anything that shows an impact. We really haven't had any sales of properties with that. So the answer is we're not sure how that will impact it in the future. It may or may not.
They could change it at any time though too, right?
Yeah.
Haven't really made it.
Yeah, and you know, it's one of those gray areas that it's tough to really, like a view, if you have a mountain view, Rocky View is a prime example of that. If you're on the west side of the hill and you see the mountain, they actually give quite a bit of adjustment to the land and or the buildings because of that view. But there's market data that helps support that. When you get to these solar ones, it's going to be a while before we can get market data to support that. So it's on our horizon, but there's no, most jurisdictions that I'm aware of are just sort of at the inventory stage of it. These can go on even non-residential, like I do, well, I know in, there's a Hutterite colony on the east side of county that there is a solar farm set up there. And they set it up prior to the change of the microgeneration capacity. And I have 50% of that assessed as non-residential and 50% as farm, because half of the power is being consumed by the farm operation. The other half is being consumed by they have a, I think it's a cabinet or cabinet woodworking shop that consumes half of that power. So in a non-residential application, but they set up a fairly big solar operation. And some of the, like even the jurisdictions that have cabins in remote areas, if you will, and power doesn't exist, but they put a solar panel in place of power, they may equate the valuation of the solar panel to the power, what they would normally add for power on a typical site. So that's some areas where there is a direct adjustment per se. It may not be the exact cost of what it is. And that's all I can say at this point.
Thank you.
Just a comment on the sheep around solar panels when you get to talking to them. So if there is no sheep around, they still are responsible for the care of that land. They have to control the weeds and keep the grass down for fire and whatnot. So they have to mow it. So it would have to be an expense. But if you put sheep in there, right, they're getting the care of the land accomplished, so they shouldn't get a tax break on that too. You understand what I'm getting at?
Exactly. And keep in mind, you have three components for farmland. You have to be the raising, production, and sale of agriculture product. So if you're just cutting the weeds down, are you selling anything? If you're raising sheep under there, and I'm not aware of any jurisdictions that have deemed any farmland under the solar yet. But again, that's the land component is part of the designated industrial assessment, the linear that is the solar generation. So it's something that is going to come as a discussion, and it may, at worst case, they may do a prorated amount where the footprint, like to figure out what the area is occupied by the structure that supports the solar panels. I don't know how that's going to shake out yet.
So you take my farm, for instance, I got a gas well there. It's on 3 or 5 acres of land, and they lease that out, right? And they're paying tax on that assessment. But my cows clean up all but 100 square feet of it. Mm-hmm. Same as having sheep. Yeah. They're going to turn around after and say, well, that's farmland now?
Well, in your case, it's always has been farmland. We don't adjust it. The only time we do an adjustment for that is if it's a gas plant, a larger facility. But if it's just a little single well battery with even if there's just a wellhead or if there's a wellhead and a separator package there, we don't take any of the assessment out of farmland. And on the linear side, they add a little bit of valuation to the well to recognize that that well plat is there and the excess market value of that. For a little while, we used to have to actually assess an area and use for the driveway, the well plat, but only where we were assessing equipment. If it was just a wellhead, it was treated as farmland, and there's a regulated farmland manual that stipulates you don't take out any of the farmland that is under, even though you may not be able to cultivate it per se, but if it's associated with that well site, you don't take the farmland out. Now, maybe they may change the legislation. The solar farms my personal opinion is that's not a farm operation. Even though they may be claiming they're just using the sheep as the mower, like you're saying.
Yeah.
But there's higher authorities that will make decision on that I have no, I don't know, I may have some commentary on that, but I'm not sure how much influence I'll have on that.
Go get it.
Some lobbying may be involved there, I'm sure. I have two more questions before we proceed. So the 350 an acre has been in place for how long since? And has there been any, other than maybe 10, 15 years ago, has there been any?
Before I started doing assessment, I'm 35 years in the business. The concept of that 350 was, it was the average market value in the, I think it was like early to mid 90s, 80s, I mean. And they ascertained that as the agriculture use value. It's slightly higher if you're in an irrigation district, it's 645. And that's the two, and don't quote me on that number, but it's around that. And it's just been like, logically, that was, the problem with farmland is when you get closer to urban centers, the farmland market value can be skewed. And to try to ascertain what is the true market value of farmland versus potential development situation. I'm going to say on the west side, good farmland is probably 6,000, maybe 7,000 an acre. On the east side, yeah, well, even higher, yeah. On the east side, 3,500 an acre. So that value, but like the stuff that's going for 10 to 15,000, there's some of that might be impacted because it's in the area structure plan that could be future developed. So even though it's still being farmed in its present state, and that's where it becomes a little bit tricky to ascertain what is the true market value. Like if a farmer was just buying land to farm to pay 10,000 an acre, I don't think he could afford to do that. Even paying 7,000 is probably pushing the envelope. So I don't think they'll ever go to a full market value in farmland because there's that bit of a influencing factor. They could easily bump it up to 3,500 an acre as an average, conservative average value, maybe even 4. But in theory, if you bump up this side of the equation, the assessment, and you want to stay revenue neutral on taxes, you just drop the mill and you'd be. But the only factor that impacts that, and the urbans are really pushing for this, is farmland does pay towards education funding. And so on the equalized assessment, farmland is always a 1, and its assessment is significantly lower than the market value. And so the guys in a $1 million house in the city of Calgary, Edmonton, they're paying education tax based on that value. That same $1 million farmland parcel can easily exist, and they're paying only on 28,000 or on 56,000 assessment maybe. So and you'll see later in the slides, actually on the tax side, the tax burden for education is quite minimal on farmland. And if the urbans had their ability, they want farmland at market right out of the gate, because they're trying to, they want to try to keep assessment pure. When you equalize it for these requisition bodies that are spread over whether it be education is the big one, but there's housing boards, there's other ones, and farmland is a bit of sacred cow, I'll say, from a provincial standpoint. I haven't seen any interest in moving that value up, and you guys are the ones that could influence that if you wanted to. But I'm not sure, even amongst the 7 of you, whether you could all agree on increasing that.
And just to the chair, one thing that Dennis has noted, and it's a very, very important concept, is that even though assessment will change, and you'll see the kind of the summary of assessment being changed, that doesn't necessarily mean the taxes change at the same rate. Mill rates are adjusted based on assessed value that come through the county. So this assessment 101 is great because we'll find out the current state of the county and the assessed values throughout the county. But the mill rate tax rate bylaw is when the mill rates are set and the budget's set. So those are 2 separate things where Dennis is purely talking about assessment. He's making some great points, and we actually really appreciate the committee being so involved today. It's great to see. Thank you.
And if I may, through the chair, augment that comment, the assessment is just a means to get the budget allocation. So you want to use the budget discussions purely to approve the budget, any change in revenue from the previous year, and ensure that you can substantiate that. And then the assessment is just a means to get you that. We'll have a video later on in the presentation that really highlights that. We had it last year. I'm not sure if you remember it, but so that's the only.
One more question from me would be, there's lots of land in agriculture that is rented. Is that any consideration for assessment value?
Unfortunately, no. And well, I shouldn't say unfortunately, but it doesn't matter who farms it. If you farm it or your neighbor farms it, or we're really honing in on those 10 and smaller size parcels to see, is that excess land really being farmed? Because when I say excess land, a minimum 3-acre site, and we're starting to flick the switch on some of those. If a guy has livestock on there, it's kind of difficult to fight that fight, if you will, to say your entire parcel isn't being farmed. Even though he's only got 1 horse, technically we could ask him to prove that they're raising something with that horse and they're selling something, like they're raising a mare or foal, whatever, and selling that. But most jurisdictions are not really getting aggressive on that side of things because it's sometimes a difficult fight. If you're under 3 acres or under, even if you're 4 acres under, that extra acre, if it's all just enclosed with the shelter belt and it's evident there's no farming, would go full market on that. The whole concept of that 3-acre site is, and I don't know if maybe I'm getting too involved here, but it was designed to draw a little bit of equity between the farmer and the acreage owner. Because at one time the farmhouse wasn't assessed, there was no value placed on that, and the acreage guy across the road was 65% of market. Now we put a 3-acre site on the farm property. Doesn't matter if you have 1 house or 24 houses like some of the colonies do, only 1 3-acre site, whereas the residents, the acreage guy across the road, has a 3-acre site, and his house and outbuildings, garage and maybe a shop, are fully at market, whereas on the farm property, maybe the garage might be a residential if he's personal use on there. He parks his Cadillac and no farm, but the outbuildings are typically farm use still, and they're exempt from assessment and tax.
So just on that a little bit further, so when you say we or they, is that the county sets that 3-acre, or is that the province?
Province says we must do it.
Okay, and we have no influence on that?
No.
Okay. Thanks, I'm good.
Just a quick question. Has Linear ever paid for school tax?
Other components of linear do. The pipeline, the wells, the telecoms, it's only the power generation components that don't. So just to be clear on that. And to my knowledge.
So railway would?
Oh yeah, railway would, yeah. From what I can recall, that exemption was brought in, I think around the same time that I started doing assessment, and it's carried forward for the power generation only.
So if solar is power generation, it doesn't pay?
Well, only But again, just to clearly understand, the solar panels themselves, but the land underneath is deemed non-residential.
Oh.
They pay on that.
Okay, okay.
The substation, buildings, fencing, there's a repair and maintenance shop. They pay municipal and education on that. It's just the solar, but by far the biggest cost or the assessment component in the power generation is those solar panels, or in the wind turbine, it's the turbines themselves.
For something like, so we put in a broadband line there, we paid for it. Who gets assessed that?
The company owns that line. So if it's Shaw or TELUS or, and again, it's a regulated valuation. Very interesting. I'm glad you guys,
No, that's great.
you
great
should be
input.
well versed for the test here soon.
Chairing this and seeing all the engagement, it's good to see, because there's always questions you get asked from the public, and the questions I'm asking, I get you're talking to somebody to rattle off all this stuff. So there's a lot of things out there. So
Well, in general terms, like especially that farm situation, if they're going past the raising stage of the livestock and they want to process that livestock or that carrot or that wheat, then you're once you get into the what some people term agribusiness, that probably is going to be non-residential, most likely.
thanks. I guess proceed.
Okay, so here's some other definitions for your intake. So market value, we're always the year prior to the valuation date. I didn't actually put the definition of market value, but I'll just recite that quickly. It's a willing buyer and a willing seller transacting in reasonable time without motivation on either party. So if you sell your house to your son and you feel sorry for him and you give him a price of, you sell it for 50% of the value, well, those sales, they're not market value. But if you sell your house to me at the full market value, well then, yeah, those sales are used in the analysis. So we analyze and review the sales to ensure that they're a true indication of market. We have very limited quantity of sales in the county. It's a lot easier to do assessment in the town of Strathmore. They have cookie cutter neighborhoods. They have lots of sales in those neighborhoods. We have a trailer beside a house, beside a intensive livestock operation. So it's a little tricky sometimes to come up with our valuation. Sometimes we try to get as close as we can based on the data that we have. We don't set the market. We analyze the market and adjust our assessments to reflect that. So the key thing is our valuation date is always July 1st, the year preceding the tax year. So we're talking 2024 tax year, but it's July 1st, 2023. We wouldn't be able to prepare the assessment to say even April 2024. We need time to calculate that, run our analysis. So it's always legislative, province-wide, July 1st market valuation date. Hint for the test. So the physical condition date is another key term in our assessment realm, and that's December 31st. And what that means is, let's say I started building a house on September 1st. By December 31st, I got it to the lockup stage. Even though it wasn't there on July 1st, we assess it at what we call an incomplete or progressive state, and that value might be maybe 50% of what its completed value would be. But we don't necessarily go December 31st. We usually use end of November as our final sort of inspection timeframe. That house is going to be a long time, so if we're a little bit, shy on that, no one, to my knowledge, is inspecting around Christmas time. That'd be the last thing I'd want to do. But that's the date that's legislated in the MGA there. So machining equipment. Now this has two dates depending on the type of machining equipment. So if it's designated industrial property, then that's not designated industrial property, it's December 31st is the physical condition date. But if it's designated industrial property, then it's October 31st. So what that means is a well site, for instance, where there's a separator, that well has to be operational because that well is, well, the equipment at that well is designated industrial property. If it's not operational by October 31st, it's not accessible. However, across the road, you could have a abattoir. If it's operational by December 31st, it's accessible. If it's not operational, then it's not accessible till the following year or once it becomes operational.
Is there a thought process behind that? Like, why wouldn't they stick to the same date for all? Just,
Yeah, part of that is because the non-dip M&E is done usually by the in-house assessor or the contract assessor, whatever the arrangement is, and all the other stuff is December 31st. It's to align that. Linear seemed to need a little more time to gather their data and to prepare the assessment, so they wanted the October 31st date. There may be more to that. I'm like, I could, there's been a lot of discussion of aligning those dates and moving them, either moving the dip to the same date or moving the other M&E back. There's been discussion even moving it back to the valuation date. And there's never been a consensus in the powers to be to align those dates. That's what it is for now. I can't really offer much more comments on that.
And just through the chair as well, when we see some of the larger properties that have power generation, they certainly do know the legislation and their requirements. So when you do see some of the larger projects come online, you'll see them come online at certain times. It's not a secret in the industry, like they understand the Alberta legislation. So a great example is the Wheatland Wind Project. You know, they came online in November of 2023. Is that right? Or,
Yeah, but only 50% of the towers, roughly.
yeah.
And so they, well, actually in 2022 and then in 2023 to balance them. So, and as Brian has indicated, industry is very well aware of this. So if their facility is close to operational and it's getting to either October or December, they're gonna probably extend it past to at least save that 1 year taxes from their perspective. Because if it's not accessible, obviously there's no taxes on it. Okay. Now we get into the numbers. I know this looks a bit daunting. I'm not going to go through all of this. I'm just going to focus you on a couple key areas where there's been some significant changes, over $100 million in assessment. So if you look at the screen here, you can see that assessment code 103, residential land and improvements, that saw 11% change overall with 153 million increase in the value. And most of that is market value change. Some of that is new houses or garages or residential buildings. An interesting thing to be cognizant of, the percentage of the assessment base hasn't changed very much. It was 31.17, and even with that market change, it's 31.91. So it's still that specific assessment code, but residential from a mill rate or tax rate standpoint includes vacant residential and some other classes. So you'll see as we go through a little further. Linear electrical power generation. This is the prime example we just talked about, the Wheatland Wind Farm, I think it's called, out in the eastern part of the county. There's about 116 million assessment increase. The bulk of the, actually, you'll see it in another slide here, but I'll give you a little preview on it. The farm, it was about 118 million, but the way the assessment year modifiers and depreciation worked for the older power generation stuff, there's about 2 million lost assessments. So the effective impact is 116 million. I'll just say that for now, and you'll see a little more detail later. So the other thing is our total assessment base was at 4.3 billion, and now we're at 4.7 billion, which is about an 8.68% change. total change in assessed value is 378 million. So that's, you know, that's the compilation of all the other assessment classes. I'm not going to go through the detail on that. What I want to draw your attention to is from a tax rate standpoint, really for municipal funding, we really boil it down to 4 classes of, like we talked about the assessment classes. There's either residential, farm, non-res, or M&E. The big thing that I wanted to draw your attention to is non-res, 151 million there. Sorry, 181 million. But I wanted to just take you a step back because non-res includes the linear added to it. So the assessment base for linear is 31% now, but that gets lumped into the non-res, which the non-res then overall is 45% of the assessment base. Linear changed about 11.2%, but when we lump that into the non-res, it's about a 9.23% change. And then M&E, which is by far the largest M&E components we have, is the well and pipeline, or sorry, the separator packages at the well sites. And there's still companies have been disconnecting stuff. We have a few new drills and new equipment added, but there's a lot of stuff being disconnected that is coming off the stream as well. They're really tightening their operations, and anything that's a marginal production well, they're probably shutting that in and disconnecting the equipment, and then eventually moving the building off. And so the building is part of the non-residential assessment, so that gets impacted as well. So even as alluded to earlier, this is just the overall assessment change. That doesn't mean the taxes will be impacted by that. It depends on what happens with the tax rate, which will be a discussion after Joel has done the budget with you guys. So here's probably a little easier thing to understand. If we look at a 5-year rolling average or percentage of assessment base, key thing to keep in mind is linear, which is the gray, the top one, it's actually just shrunken a little bit. And the reason being is those wells and pipelines that have been shut in, even though we have some new stuff coming online, but that hasn't offset what we've lost in the wells and pipelines. Plus, there's some adjustments in the assessment year modifiers or the assessment calculation of those wells and pipelines. The orangey color is the M&E. It stayed almost flatline compared to 5 years ago. From last year, it decreased a little bit, but the 5-year average is, you know, we're at 18 and 18.06. The non-residential, which is the blue color on the, again, this will be page 9 of the agenda item or package there. It's almost flatline too. Saw a little bit of a decrease, even though we've had some new stuff added. But again, some of the stuff has been like the buildings, compressor buildings. There's been at least I can think of 3 or 4 this year that got removed. They weren't in use anymore. There's a site, a couple sites got completely reclaimed south of Nameka, north of Standard, kind of, where, you know, a couple of years ago there was a really old equipment there, and now that's almost back to farmland. The really notable change is residential keeps increasing, and it's a bigger percentage of the pie. And that's for 2 reasons. We got new growth, partly, but the majority impact is the market value. Property that 5 years ago you could probably buy for $375,000. That same property is about probably $475,000 now, if not more, depending on where you're situated. So that market value change is causing the percentage of the pie to increase. And then conversely, and we chatted a bit about this, farmland flatline, a little bit of decrease because some of that gets absorbed into either residential or non-residential, and the rates on that have been stagnant. There hasn't been any changes, no new farmland created. So the valuation is being a smaller percentage of the pie, if you will. Okay, now we get into a little more detail about kind of the average assessment changes in different market areas. I just highlighted some of the areas because you all live throughout, but some of the bigger changed areas, Lakes of Merrifield, the average market value increased from 540 to 589,000, about a 9% change. If we look at Speargrass, about the same percentage change, not quite the same average value. And then Market Zone 7,000, which is our west side of the county, most of the area, that's our highest market area. And that saw the same thing. Average market value increased from 533 to 10.5, or sorry, 589, 10.5%. And then when you go to range 22, which is kind of the just east of the central area, the values there, went from 347 to 3. So the lowest change was 4%. The highest change was 23.5%. The key thing to be aware of, which is this is used when we're going to talk the tax rates later. So the average 2022 assessment for 2023 was roughly 430,500. That same average assessment, again, this is a calculated average, has gone to 474,500 or 645. So about a 10% change overall. And then this is the breakdown for non-residential, which is on page 11 of the agenda package. Same sort of concept. The thing with non-residential, there's a lot smaller parcel counts that exist. And so if someone builds a new shop in an area, it could really skew the average because you only had maybe 3 before, now you have 4 properties. And a prime example of that is if you look at the very bottom, market location 9100, 37% increase. That's one of the colonies in the very east side of the county has a window and door manufacturing building and stuff. And that was a bit incomplete in 2022. It got completed in 2023. And so all of a sudden the average has jumped up quite a bit, but there isn't very many commercial properties in there. So, this isn't like a town of Strathmore where if you look at the market areas that have non-residential, their average is a little more, what's the term, steady changes, if you will. The other big thing to note is market value changes on non-residential overall is a lot less than residential. We don't have the same market forces out here. The only exception to that is Origin Business Park. If you look at towards the middle of this slide, they saw a 24% change in the market. Most of that was the land component. The land values on that is starting to escalate or increase, if you will. And I think that's going to continue. That's that value there is probably the most attractive area from a market standpoint. You go into Rocky View, you're paying probably at least a minimum 50,000 to 100,000 more per acre. So that area I can see as being a growth area. Plus, as new construction comes on, that's going to skew this average as well. So I'm going to kind of go through these other slides a little quicker because we've chatted a bit about this. Hopefully you get a bit of understanding the linear component versus the designated industrial. I'm still a delegate, so I still work on the valuation for these properties. I'm contracted by the province to do that assessment. The biggest thing is just so visually you can understand, and actually the next slide will give us a better understanding of it, but the well site, if there's only a wellhead, that's all linear. Once you put equipment on the site, you put excluding a pump jack, but if you put a separator or a compressor, that's part of the designated industrial property. I still do the valuation for that. Okay, so here's one that I want to just hone in on a bit. This is an example. So this, if you see the screen here, the circle around this tank, that's part of the process or machinery equipment designated industrial property. if you look at the building here, the building itself is part of the designated industrial, but it's non-residential. So they would be paying education tax on that, whereas the tank, they wouldn't, plus the preferential assessment treatment. Also in this photo it shows a little vessel sticking out. That's actually the separator. So that separator is part of the machining equipment. There's a term, inlet and outlet valve, that's used to differentiate where machining equipment exists at a well site. And so that inlet valve is most likely right here, the left side of that circle there. So everything, the piping to the tank and to the separator, the tank itself is part of designated industrial. Those pump jacks in the back, however, though, are part of the linear assessment. They're supposedly included in the rate for the well. I say that because it's not clearly identified in the linear rates. I gotta be careful what oh yeah, never mind. And the pipeline portion here is part of the pipeline. This is where the well, this is actually probably the outlet side. This is where the product is that was the gas that was knocked out goes into this pipeline, or oil, depending on what the situation is, and goes to the battery location or the plant site. Okay, so I took some excerpts from the linear assessment. And this is where I said earlier, so change due to growth, 118 million. So that's any new power generation that would be mostly that wind farm. But the change due to other, and they define other as AYM changes, Schedule C, which is depreciation schedule. So if we wouldn't have had that new power generation, the wind farm, we would have actually lost 2 million assessment. So the net impact is 116 million, which I used actually the new assessment potential revenue stream based on the old mill rate, the 2023 mill rate, is about 960,000. That's a very rough calculation.
And just to note through the chair, this is a very important slide because council strategy kind of throughout setting mill rates and taxation budgets have been, let's not try to increase the overall taxation on a resident. And this is a prime example of kind of waiting till we get new assessment to come online. So this is a great example of how in our budget, like additional, depending on the mill rate, 900,000 to $1 million will come online without any additional impact or burden on existing ratepayers with, little to no changes on their residents, of course, outside of market value changes. And another just kind of interesting thing that council can kind of just think about is that, so this one, the change in assessment and the change due to growth is 118 million. So when Dennis and I kind of chat about this one as well, just a rough number that you could use in your head is that the Wheatland Wind Project is the one that came online, and it's published that it's 120 megawatt facility. So kind of a rough estimate that we kind of use is between 900,000 and $1 million per megawatt for like a wind project. So just kind of a statistic to kind of keep in your head. Or even if you're looking at another wind project in the province, that might be a good baseline to kind of consider.
Yeah, and if I may, the one caveat on that is the cost of the new types of power generators, especially on the wind farm. That cost seems to be sliding down each year. So if you build a project 5 years from now, if it costs 100,000 per megawatt or $1 million per, it may be 800,000. Like it could be a lower cost. So that industry plus the solar farms, that technology is a rapid change in industry, and the cost on that is sliding down. So that's part of the reason why, if we wouldn't have had this, the cost modifiers to adjust what was in place prior are actually seeing a bit of a decrease, because the cost factors associated to rebuild that, if you will, are lower than say 2 or 3 years ago.
So the flip side of that, though, is we have some oil and gas that we've already heard are disappearing. So we got to have an estimated prediction on how that's going to affect us in the next couple of years. And what if wind and solar take the same route as oil and gas and basically have the same problems with paying their bills and appealing it to a higher authority than us, which is, I could see it happening because if they're quite successful and then we're assuming this is going to stay there and it could, in 5 years' time, could be half of that or a quarter of that. Like it's a balance and it's history of what's happened already. Like you can see the writings on the wall and we still haven't gotten through, like how much are we currently owed on some of these oil and gas wells?
We could pull that number. We do
Yeah.
report those
I
numbers
thi-
to the province and RMA.
Yeah.
I'm just like uncollected. That's a kind of a.
Yeah, the
quarterly
uncollected, I think
survey
is
we're
part,
doing now.
just something we gotta
I
deal
just
with.
don't have the number off the top of my head, but we can certainly get that for
I think
the
it's
committee.
good to have for just in the back of our minds because that's the political climate, I guess, right now sometimes. And if you look on the federal level, it's terrifying
So
from some of that stuff too. So
if I may offer a couple comments, we're actually in a very fortunate state that we have, as a percentage of uncollectibles, we have a very small percentage. We have a larger company that did go on a tax agreement to spread their taxes over 3 or 4 years. But compared to other municipalities, we have some fairly economically functional oil companies, if you will, and they've been paying most of them have been paying tax without arrears. The wind situation, I think, is a little bit different because there was some incentives given by the federal government to help fund some of the capital costs. I'm not sure if there is on the operational side, but that green initiative is a real movement. And I don't know if that will help maintain the viability of these companies. That's still a wait and see. I don't know that we wouldn't be able to predict with any certainty what stability they would be in. So it's something that it's a wait and see. I would think that they should be in probably a more viable state than than even the natural gas wind power generators and stuff because of that initiative. But that's all I got to say on that. So the other thing is I wanted to make sure that you had a bit of understanding. We're kind of delving into a little bit of tax, but it is directly impacted by assessment. On page 15, we got an updated letter from the municipal affairs. And I just want to recoup that there was a tax holiday announced in 2020 for any to encourage new investment for well and pipeline assets. Those properties will receive assessment of 0 for the next 3 years. But that's only the pipeline and the well. The dip assessment, so the equipment on site, I could still assess and have been assessing that if it exists. Most of our shallow gas doesn't have any equipment. It's the deep gas or the oil production out the eastern part of the county is where there's equipment needed. And so the province has been indicating, municipal affairs, that 2024 is the last year they give them this tax holiday. On page 16 is a little bit of a kind of guesstimate of what the tax impact was. For 2024, there was, or 2023 assessment, 2024 taxation year, there was 23 new pipelines and 30 wells, and their assessment would have been 16,511,000, but that got put at 0. And so if we use the current mill rate for non-residential, that's about 134,000 revenue that we're not seeing this year. Cumulatively, over the last 3 years, there's about $80 million of lost assessment. So this is what potentially will come on stream for 2024 assessment, 2025 tax year. Again, a very rough calculation based on our municipal, I'm only showing the municipal portion here. There's about 657,000 potential revenue coming on stream for 2025 tax year. Okay. Are you ready for the test or the questions first?
Does anybody have any further questions? I think we've gone through most of them.
Okay, so 4 quick questions. First one is, and you'll kind of show by raise of hands, is farmland assessed at market value? Raise your hand if it is. Wow, 100%. Next question is residential. Is that assessed as a by a regulated rate? Raise your hand if you think it is. Wow, you guys are 100%, 2 for 2. Non-residential, is any component of that assessed at market value? Yes or no? Raise your hand if you think yes. 100% again. And the component of non-residential is the buildings and the land. When you get to the linear side of non-residential, that's the component that is at a regulated rate. So thank you for your time, and I really appreciated your commentary on this.
Thank you very much. No further questions for this? We have a request for a break. We'll take a 10-minute break. We'll be back at 10:26, 10:25. Okay, pardon me. We're back and we're going to go to 2.22, 2024 final budget update. Go ahead.
Good morning, Joel here from Financial Services. Be hard to follow up from Dennis's very well presented information. So he did a great job. So just kind of give you some background as to the overall budget process and every year, and just as a refresher, what we typically do is around August, we kind of start doing our plans for the next year with management and putting together capital and operating budgets, and in discussions within our software, compiling all of that together, and then usually have meetings with council around November, early December, and deliberate, provide a lot of substantial details on specific capital projects and the operating budget. And that's the point when a lot of the operating plans and the capital plans for the upcoming year are kind of put in place and approved by council. And that's the interim budget. That's what's approved at the end of December or mid-December, pretty much every year. It gives the authorization to spend into the new year, and most of the expenditure items are approved at that point. So now we roll forward to end of March, beginning of April, and the final operating budget and the final capital budget. And the main reasons or focus of this period of time is it gives an opportunity for any kind of material changes to expenditures, anything that's maybe been approved by council in a resolution kind of in that in-between term as an increase can be thrown into the budget, whether it's a capital or operating item. Because as Dennis had mentioned, we have an updated assessment base from the prior year, and there's some budget items, as we'll look just kind of in a minute here, that the budget itself is impacted by the assessed values. So we can update for that. And then of course, the biggest piece is the property tax revenue item, and that's the around 70% of the county's revenue source is from property taxes. So it's a substantial piece of that, and that goes hand in hand with the property tax bylaw, which comes up on Tuesday next week, along with the final operating capital budgets. So just kind of go through the operating budget briefly, some of these changes. So there's a lot of line items here, and but I'll just kind of do a high-level summary. What we do is we break out, in this table anyways, we wanted to show the total expenditures from the 2023 approved budget, and now where we're at with the 2024 approved budget and the total change in expenditures. And then we categorize those based on whether it's a requisition, and we kind of segregate that $840,000 separately. The reason for that is the requisitions are kind of a flow through, right? We collect them on behalf of the school district, on behalf of the province, on the tax bill, and when we send that cash right through. So they're shown as a gross expense in here, but we wanted to make sure that they were segregated because we are collecting the revenue that offsets that. So then we go into a general categories, and a lot of these have kind of all of these have been discussed for the most part. The interim budget, the contract service line, the largest one there was mainly driven by the contract services that are going to be undertaken in the water and wastewater servicing area. And then the second line there too is there's just various public works items, inventory, supplies, oil, and asphalt supplies and things that have also shown an increase from last year. So those are kind of our two largest increases in the budget from year to year in terms of the final budget. So we also show two other categories here. I'll just go to the bottom. The one-time project changes, try and segregate those just kind of to highlight that these aren't ongoing structural costs to the county necessarily, right? They're kind of one-time items, and that's sort of been in the report as well that we kind of noted too. There's a lot of investment in infrastructure right now in the last 4, 5, 6 years even in the county, and that's kind of a way to look at it as an investment, right? Whether we're talking about broadband infrastructure or things like that, we're putting things in the ground to allow for future growth of business and the economy. And so that's where we see a lot of these larger projects and costs right up front in the interim. So then we have the total change. I broke down on the bottom here, taking out the requisition totals, because our total change in budget, if we include the school requisitions and whatnot, are around $1.6 million from year to year. But if we take out those requisitions, then the total change in budget is about $750,000 if we include all those three different categories. So this next one is just a similar table. It looks identical, but this is just kind of to show the changes from the approved interim budget and where we're at in terms of what's been put in the final operating budget. And again, we've done this similar thing to break out those requisitions and the changes that have come in from that regard, because those, again, net out to zero. With the cash that we collect and pay back. The general categories, a lot of these will probably should be familiar. The largest one there being, we have the resolution number, the request to increase the Wheatland Community Fund budget for the year. Now, there's a couple I'll highlight here in terms of the ones that I mentioned that are assessment driven. So we have the fire budget itself, the fire funding policy, I believe it's 12.2. It prescribes that we use a certain percentage of the total assessment balances in order to fund certain aspects of the fire budget. And that includes amounts that go to the fire associations for their operating, and they have some small capital funding that they get, and those are all driven by the assessed values. And so once Dennis provided those a new assessment for 2023, then we were able to recalculate those new budgets for the operating side and input them for this final budget. So that would include the CURB as well. That the kind of the bucket of funds that's in that program is also based on the assessed value and a percentage of the prior year. So in this case, the 2023 assessment base.
And if I may, Joel, just through the chair, so those two items, the fire funding and the CURB funding, those are kind of just two anomalies in our budget, it's totally okay the way they're being treated. It's just important for the committee to note that they're being treated differently. So as our assessment goes up, the funding formula for them stays same, so they grow. However, when our mill rate drops, that means it's a less overall taxation piece for the county. So higher investment in fire and the community enhancement regional board. Totally fine. Just wanted to point that out so it's crystal clear to the committee.
I suppose before I proceed to the capital section, I'll just ask if there's any questions around the operating changes that have been shown.
Don't see any hands up.
Through the chair, I can maybe just provide a few more supplemental comments. So when Joel is talking, or when Joel mentioned about just the investment in growth, that isn't just, new developments are coming into Wheatland County. We're investing in, roads, subterranean infrastructure. It also includes other items that are beneficial to the whole entire county, such as our investment in the gravel pits that we bought. So that was, I think, around $6 million that we paid over the last couple years. So what that'll do is that'll set the county up for 80 years of gravel, so far into the future. The Antero water license that the county bought as well, that one's not being used at this point in time, but that is for also future growth. And those are kind of just one-time expenditures that are, well, Joel has it up there. Maybe I jumped the gun, but yeah, just wanted to point those out as well, is that it's not just for development itself, but it is for all of the county and existing pressures that the municipality faces that needs to be addressed. And it's good to address them up front, and that's why you may see a little bit of a dip in reserves over time. And I'm sure Joel will get into that. Thank you.
When we buy that gravel pit, it's a cost, but do you amortize that over the years? Because we're not using the gravel, we just use a few rocks every year, right?
Yes, so through the chair, so that gravel itself, it's funny how the municipality must report on our financial statements. So we have financial assets, then we have liabilities, and then we have a total net asset number. And then actually gravel is one of the items that actually falls below both of those categories in non-financial assets. When the gravel is being expensed throughout the year, we will reduce that non-financial asset and we'll bring it up into our expenditures. But it is prepaid, so it's kind of like a non-cash transaction. The county also will crush gravel, so our pit run into smaller aggregates for road use. Sometimes we just use pit run or we sell it. But the cost of that also gets added back into the cost of the asset. So that gravel one, we actually have a significant amount of gravel and probably one of the higher counts in Alberta for a municipality, actually. And it's a great thing to have because obviously we have 2,500 kilometers of roads that need gravel from time to time. Sometimes we'll, when we expand a road, we need more gravel and stuff like that, especially if our internal crews are doing it. So it's great to have. But yeah, so it sits below all the financial statement numbers. It's on the financial statement, of course, but when it does get used, it kind of gets drawn down over time. But then you also see that number get driven up because of the cost that we'll have to do on to add into the non-financial asset for crushing the gravel itself. That kind of gets added into the cost.
Perfect. Thanks, Brian. So on to capital. So the interim capital budget, we have the total there near the bottom there. It was approved at around $37.6 million. And here we have requests for some changes since the approval process, around $2 million. Now, for some perspective, about half of that is having to do with carry forwards. So there would be already 2023 approved items or projects that were for various reasons not completed. And there's some comments on them in the table as well. And so we carry forward those budgets just so that we can have I guess a budget line item to put against the actuals that they're going to spend this year. And so that we kind of know they've been approved in the prior year already, but it just it makes sense to bring the budget forward and finish that up. And then the other half of that, actually the largest portion of that is a request here to add in around $900,000 just for this kind of recently approved land purchase. And again, that's one of these items that kind of came up after the interim budget was approved. And so there's a resolution and we know that it's been approved and it's happened. So we know we can add it into the final budget. And it just kind of makes sense in that regard.
And one thing I'd also like to note in that actual approved number, so that $39 million, it's a substantial budget for Wheatland. It's one of the higher budgets, capital budgets that have been brought forward in a long time. However, we do need to just remember that of that 39 million, that a lot of it is for future growth. So the raw water line to service Goldfinch would be in that budget. So if you back that out, which will be debentured, obviously it's got to come back to council to be debentured through the borrowing bylaw, but that is our intent to do that. So, and that is integral to service the Goldfinch ASP, which has come back to council a number of times. Thank you.
Yeah, and so just to follow that up in terms of the funding sources and percentages for that total budget, as Brian mentioned here, and I'll just zoom in a little bit so they're easier to read. The debenture proportion for that, if that comes to fruition, is about $12.3 million, or 31% of the total proposed final capital budget. And I believe it was during the interim process too, where we had presented the council's or county's debt load capacity. And so at the moment, with the financial statements just kind of being finalized for 2023, to just give you an updated refresh on that number, the capacity for debt now is about $51 million. So it's well within that 12 million that's kind of in the hopper for the upcoming year here. Is there any questions before?
Yeah. I know how I treat debt on my farm, but is municipal the same way? We'll pay our $12 million for that thing and it's this year and we can start depreciating it, but we still got the debt payments to make for the next number of years. So how does that get entered in? Do we capitalize it right up front, like we paid for it? But the debt payments just go on another line, like debt payment, or we don't take a percentage of that pipe and move it down the years, so to say? Or is it like?
Yeah, through the chair. So in terms of the asset itself, it would be treated separately from the funding method. We build the asset and then we would amortize that as per the accounting standards based on, let's say if it's a road, we do 40 years or what type of road, right? And so that's the structure itself and the cost. And then in terms of the funding method, which would be whether it's debt or reserves, it's kind of a separate process. So then, of course, if you're incurring debt for that, then the county has that, gets the cash right up front, and then they have that amortization schedule for the payment and repayment of that debt that's with the province based on whatever the term of that debt was arranged on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that answers my question. Sometimes with municipal financing, it's different than.
Yeah, and just to kind of, through the chair, just to supplement Joel's comments. So the requirement to include that debt obligation is actually, it's in the MGA. It's under 243 sub 1 sub B. The amount needed to pay the debt obligations in respect to borrowings made to acquire, construct, remove, or improve capital property is required to be in the contents of an operating budget.
See no further questions.
Okay, I'm just going to go back up to so that kind of covers a summary of changes for the proposed operating and capital final budget upcoming. But I do just want to point out a couple areas in terms of like what we might call in the accounting world accumulated surplus or reserves. And so with again the 2023 financial statements being forthcoming here, we were able to kind of put those upcoming reported reserve values in here and then project forward as well So what we did here for the 2024, this would be the end of year projected reserve balances. We took the average spend on kind of generally how much we spend on the capital relative, like the actuals relative to what we budget. Hence, and again, back to the concept of carry forwards. If we're not finishing something that's approved and we're bringing it forward to the new year, it's kind of related to that. So as you can see, there's a spike up here. Now, we often mention this. This is mainly due to the Muirfield assets that came online in 2020, and that brought up our reserve balances. And then with the ongoing investments in infrastructure, and some of it's not even capital assets in the strictest sense for like the accounting wise for the accounting, but such as the broadband and some other items here that Brian had mentioned, and we kind of noted in the report here. There's various areas of investment that are treated different financially, but in the end of the day, they are kind of all investments in the community and in the infrastructure. And so those kind of outflows of cash have shown or correspond to our kind of decrease in reserves across the last couple of years. So then just to talk through, and this might be a good transition to our revenue discussions and tax rates. So to go back to the change in the total municipal costs from the interim budget, it worked out to about $500,000. I could probably just go. It's 514,000. So what that works out to, if you take that as a percentage of our tax revenue from 2023, that works out to about 1.7%, 1.72. And so what we proposed here, or kind of drafted, was a couple of different options or just comparatives to show like what kind of the revenue looks like in terms of the approach. So in the interim budget, we had a 3% kind of placeholder value for property taxes. And so what we're showing here is that 3% plus the additional 500,000, which is the 1.72%. That's where that total 4.72% comes from in terms of revenue increases for municipal taxes. And so in terms of dollars, that works out to about 1.4 million. But then I do want to bring kind of this circle back to what Brian was referring to, and I think Dennis as well, and just kind of to emphasize the total revenue that we were requiring if we were to propose or go with that scenario increase of the 1.4 million. If we back out the approximate wind farm revenue of that from the like 900,000, then that comes to about $480,000 of additional revenue that's kind of distributed on the other, I guess, everything other than the wind farm, if that makes sense. So this is kind of how we wanted to just structure this proposal. And I think a good kind of segue into discussing the revenue and the tax options here. But is there any questions in terms of the expenditure side of budgets and on capital and operating?
Not seeing any hands up.
Yeah, I think that would conclude this unless Brian has anything else to add.
I'll just reiterate the point of, well, through the chair, I'll reiterate the point of that new wind generation, the Wheatland Wind Farm coming on, which is excellent for this. So even though, like as you kind of see in the middle of your screen, the total revenue required based on our interim and then the changes. So we sit around just below 5%. And that's just for the municipal portion only. So as council may be aware that the province froze their education mill rate as well. So that in itself is probably around a 12% increase on that portion alone. So we can definitely calculate out. So when the resident sees their final tax bill, it would be higher than the 1.63 proposed. Well, that the average bill would see, including the Wheatland Wind project, which is a big shot for the county in regards to municipal revenue. So again, if we didn't have the Wheatland Wind revenue coming online this year, it would be effectively a 4.72% tax increase, give or take the other new adjustments coming on and off. But realistically, for a new parcel or a existing parcel, the overall increase would be 1.63%, roughly. Obviously subject to mill rates being set, so that number would move a little bit, but not a whole heck of a lot. Thank you.
Proceed.
I think that's it for my portion of the budget presentation.
So we'll move on to 2.3, municipal tax revenue options presentation.
Just prior to Dennis starting his presentation, one thing I just want to kind of refresh council on, and council is acutely aware of this, is that just the reason for administration taking this process where we present the budget first and the tax rate option second is that is a requirement under the Municipal Government Act that a council must pass your capital and operating budgets first prior to the tax rate bylaw being set second. So these two documents certainly do work together, but it's just kind of the procedurally why administration presents the budget first and then the tax option second.
Okay, council, welcome again. It's Dennis from the Assessment Department, Manager of Assessment Services. I wanted to start off this presentation with a couple little bit of informative video, and unfortunately this quote that I thought was rather appropriate. Nobody likes paying taxes, but it's a unfortunate sure thing, and it'd be better if you didn't have to pay the taxes till after you lived your life. So last year we presented this video, and I think it's a good reminder of the relationship between assessment and taxes and budget, how those three things come together. So I'll start with the video and then we'll go into the presentation here. Sorry, hang on. Good thing we got the IT guy here. I got to take this off the screen here.
There you go.
Okay, so any questions on that? I think it's a good refresher on the concept of how assessment relates to your taxes, and especially when there's new construction, new improvements, buildings get added. The average resident, I think, expects that their taxes shouldn't increase very much because there's more people paying to offset those services. Inflationary adjustments, I think people can rationalize with that, but if it's more than that, it could be a. So the goal of this next presentation is just to help you achieve the budget discussion or value that Joel just discussed, and recognized the difference if you went with the interim budget value versus the new budget unapproved, but value, how the mill rate change would impact that, along with the change in the assessment and how the associated tax impact would be on that. We'll dive a little bit into education at the very tail end. And then also at the end, I'll give you a 5-year synopsis or a sheet here that shows what the tax impact was over the last 5 years, just for municipal portion. Actually, it has education on there as well. And you'll see from that we're, from the municipal side, we've been fairly conservative on the tax increases from year to year. Education is a bit of hit and miss on that, so. Okay, so on page 31 of the agenda package, you can see it looks like a fairly maybe a bit boggling chart, but I want to break this down into small pieces to make it easy for you to understand. First, I want you to focus your attention towards the bottom left-hand corner. We always got to look back before we can move forward. So in 2023, we had a budget amount of $29,501 million. We were fortunate that we actually saw some gain in assessments. Most of that was the sale of the vacant lots in Lakes of Murrayfield. They become taxable. When they were county owned, they were exempt. There was a couple little minor corrections on a couple properties. And so our year-end actual revenue was about 13,000 higher than what we budgeted for. This doesn't always happen every year, because just a refresher, assessment is subject to scrutiny. People can appeal their assessments if they feel there's a concern. Actually, they don't even have to appeal. If they call us and they identify that there's some inventory issues with the property, we'll fix it. Prime example, if their basement flooded and they didn't advise us prior to finalizing the assessment, as long as they can prove to us that that happened in the valuation year, we would most likely consider doing that adjustment, as long as it wasn't repaired in that same year. There's also potential for non-residential assessment appeals and potential lost assessments. We were fortunate that, having a nominal increase is better than having a decrease, and we target our budget pretty good. We also allocate some in the budget aspect for potential appeals and uncollected taxes. So this is assuming that all the tax dollars are collected. Not always 100% of they are, but for comparative purpose, this is indicating what our actual revenue would have landed at year end in 2023 tax year. So the initial budget, actually before I do that, the average assessment, just to refresh you on that, farmland 28,000, based on the farmland mill rate, the taxes were $366 for municipal funding. Same calculation is shown towards the top left-hand corner. Municipal taxes just shy of $1,400 for average residential. Those valued at $430,000 in the 2022 year for the 2023 tax year, and same sort of calculation for the non-residential. The other part I wanted to draw your attention to is the percentage of the pie that the revenue is generated from the 4 main classes of assessment: farmland, residential, non-res. Roughly, by far the biggest percentage of the funding for municipal tax revenue comes from the non-residential category. 76%. Residential's funding about 14%, and and farmland's about 8%. The chart just further below just breaks that non-residential, because even though M&E is a separate assessment class, it has to have the same taxation rate as the non-residential. So if we break it down and look at the linear component, it's about 36% of the tax revenue, 30% of the assessment base. Whereas machinery equipment, 18% of the assessment base, it was, and now it's, and it was 22% of the tax revenue for 2023 tax year. So I'm not going to go in much more detail on that, just to give you an overview of that. So the first option identified here is looking at trying to generate the revenue for your interim budget around that 30.4 million, which is about a 3% increase from the actual revenue of last year. It's about an 885,000 increase. So I'm going to go through this next center area in a little more detail, but the same concepts will apply to the second option. In order to calculate the same distribution of the pie to generate farmland at 3% of the revenue, because the assessment has very nominal change, we have to actually adjust the mill rate just slightly. We have to bump it to 13.421 to generate the same percentage of the tax burden, 3% as was, that's assessment change. Where's the, oh, sorry, this chart doesn't have the percentage. Oh no, here it does, yeah. It was 8.86, and based on this revenue calculation or tax rate calculation, it's still the same percentage of the pie. The residential, we actually, and then towards the top of the chart here, we show what the tax impact would be based on the assessment change. Well, there was no assessment change in farmland, so they experienced the full 3% tax impact. Residential though, like remember in our assessment 101, we had about 150 million, I think, overall change. Based on that change, we had to reduce the mill rate a little bit more than farmland to keep the same percentage of the pie. So the mill rate effectively would drop to 2.9175. If we apply that mill rate to the new assessment, because the average assessment increased to 474,500, based on this option, there would be about a $30 change in the tax situation for a property that was assessed at 430 and increased to 474,500. And then the same concept is for non-residential. We want to try to sprinkle the tax burden, the increase, 3% evenly across all the classes of assessment. And by doing that, we had to adjust the mill rate slightly to get to that situation. In this case, the average property that saw an increase from 1.26 million or 1,026,000 to 1,073,000 would actually see a little bit of decrease in taxes. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is towards the bottom of that chart, the new wind farm, the 116 million, the net assessment after the changes to the existing power generation one, about 116 million. Well, in this option, the tax revenue generation is about 900,000 based on this new mill rate. Now, because we're dealing with large assessed values and we can only use a decimal place of 4.4 decimal places on the tax rate, we never can really calculate the exact revenue dollar that we're budgeting for. We were budgeting for, on this scenario, 30,399,000. We actually generated 30,402,000. So we're about 2,000 over what we're budgeted for. But this option doesn't achieve what your final projected budget amount is. This is just to show you what the tax situation would be based on the interim budget approval. Any questions on this?
No questions? Keep going.
Okay, well, that's went good. So the same concept exists in this option 2A, but this actually is achieving a budget dollar amount that you want, which is 30.9. Remember on the page 23 of Joel's presentation, it showed the two options there, and the second option was the 30.9, a $500,000 increase roughly from the interim budget. Well, the mill rate changes in here reflect that. So in this case, we need to bump up farmland just marginally more, the tax rate on it. So here, based on the tax rate of 13.7074, $17 additional tax revenue from last year. And now we're sprinkling that 4.72% increase uniformly again for the assessment classes. So the 125,000 more revenue would come from farmland compared to 2023 percentage of the pie. Same concept for residential. The mill rate goes just slightly higher from the option 2 at option 1 at 2.963. It still is an overall decrease in the mill rate, but remember the average assessment has increased for everybody. So the tax burden situation is about a $52 increase based on this option. And again, I want to tie that to the concept of the assessment change was from a 430 to a 474. So if you're in Lakes and Merrifield, where the average change is closer to, like it bumped up to 500 and some thousand, you're going to see a little higher tax increase on that. We're talking just based on this sort of specific average change. And in non-residential, in this case, instead of seeing a decrease of $21, which was what option 1 had shown, this one shows a little bit of an increase, $117, based on the change in assessment from 1.026 million to 1.073. And again, just to draw your attention, the new wind farm in this situation funds about 914,000. So for the linear component, they're funding the biggest, like we're looking at 1.4 million change in revenue overall. 839,000 is coming from the wind farm based on this tax situation. Well, sorry, not the wind farm, total linear assessment change, but the wind farm itself is funding 914,000. And this gets your target budget number that will hopefully be what you approve on April 2nd. And we have a tax rate bylaw ready for these tax options, which we think would be the best option to consider for funding the year updated budget number of around a 30.9 million.
Thank you. Questions? I imagine admin's looking for some favorable direction on one of the two options, or
Yes, through the chair. So administration's hope today is that we can kind of gather the committee's feedback on a preferred route. We had some other options in the middle, but we thought we'd provide the range to the committee. So 3 was the interim, and then 4.72% increase was our recommendation. Obviously, it's totally subjective to council's approval. We just need some direction. And kind of our hope is because on the 2nd, it is a large day with the approval of the budget first, and then we'll just need some time to actually create that bylaw itself. And then we need to print our notices, which is quite a big undertaking. And we got to mail them all out, which is again a big undertaking as well. If the committee can't provide direction today, that's okay as well. We might just need to call a special council meeting to approve that bylaw at a future date, just so we do have time to make sure it's right. It's a big decision for council. Probably one of the biggest ones of the year, to be honest. That's one that impacts every single ratepayer in the county. So we totally respect that as well. So yeah, looking to see if the committee could provide any direction today on the options that you see here. And I'll leave it to the committee. Thank you.
and being that it's a committee, we really can't give a motion of direction. So I guess it would more, are these two options acceptable would be a good start, right? And then kind of go around and for whoever wants to provide their input, now's the time. So they can get everything together for the meeting. And then also we have a pretty ambitious capital projects as well for future proofing the county for development and things like that. So that's, I think, was addressed here as well. So.
Yes, and maybe this would be a good segue for Dennis to hand out just kind of a synopsis over the last 5 years, how the taxes have kind of
Sure, that'd be great.
fallen out, just so the committee has all this information. It's actually very interesting to see. I know one of council's big undertakings has been kind of during the affordability crisis for Wheatland County residents, the tax increases have been minimal to none. So I would say in 2020, the council directed administration to, during that time of the unknown, to really cut services. So that was great because the expenses fell and the revenue fell. So that was like perfectly offsetting. It was great. However, during the last number of years, just with inflationary pressures that the municipality has faced, the council definitely has recognized that, it is impacting residents as well. So the tax increases have been kept to a minimum. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that administration, the municipality hasn't faced those increases as well. So administration has been kind of working our way, finding efficiencies and things like that. It just compounds kind of year over year. And that's kind of why you'd see a bigger increase here as well. And, part of council's strategy on this whole thing was waiting for larger assessment projects to come online. However, that doesn't mean that the strategy of council doesn't change. And that's something for council to determine. Thank you.
Perfect. So for the committee, we could circle back to this towards the end of the meeting too as well to digest all this information. I imagine we will have lunch at some point today. And then we could park this and come back to it if that's all right, or we could discuss it now, whatever the committee's desires are, just to give some direction, help staff. For sure. Looking to the committee. Go ahead.
If I may, through the chair, I think there's a couple other slides that may just help digest this change a bit. So I'll put those back on. Maybe I'll just overview this high level if I could, just to make sure you have a good understanding of this scenario. As Brian alluded to, we thought that we'd want to give you a understanding of what historical tax impact has been associated with the assessment. And this chart nicely demonstrates that. And if I'll just quickly maybe highlight residential change over the last 5 years. So if you look at in column B, and I specifically printed the column headings just to make it easy to reference. In column B, a residential tax burden was for municipal taxes around $1,379, and that was based on a mill rate of 3.63, and the average assessment was 379. We did the same calculation for education funding, and it was around 973. So the total taxes was around 2316. And if I only put the 4.72% option on this chart. So in column H on the right-hand side there, that same scenario would see over a 5 year, well, actually over a year-to-year change. So from 2024 to 2023, $173 impact. $52 of that is municipal funding. $121 of that is education funding. I think if this option was selected by council, we would definitely want to make sure we have a strong media campaign that indicates the bigger percentage of your tax burden is a result of the education requisition increase due to the municipal affairs holding the tax rate on that, and the equalized assessment caused about a 9.5% or 10% increase in the requisition amount. So I could go through each one if you wanted to, but it's the same concept. Farmland, based on this option, this 4.72% option, they're seeing about $18 impact in taxes. And non-res would see, like, that's total taxes include. In farmland, it's the reverse. The municipal side captures more of the revenue, and the education is a very small percentage of the impact, because the tax rate for education funding is the same for farmland and residential. And then the non-res would see about a $344 change. And if I could, through the chair, I'd just like to go through the next 3 slides on the actual agenda item. Those even break that down a little more impact. So let me pop up my. So this one is, again, looking at the 2023 tax year and comparing it to the 2 options. And we're trying to give you an understanding what the impact could be per month. So at the 3%, which is, you know, your interim budget number, your taxes would change $30.39 or $2.53 per month. And even though the assessment increased by 10%, because that's 430 to 474, that shows that the tax rate doesn't follow the assessment because of the calculations were only spreading the burden over all the assessment base. And at the 4.72, which is what we're recommending, that same burden goes up to about a $52 change, $4.38 per month impact, if you will. So this is highlighting the residential. Any questions on this? So the non-residential, we did the same sort of calculation. At the 3%, it would be a $21 reduction, but again, you won't achieve your budget number. At the 4.72, you'll achieve your budget number, and that's $9.80 roughly per month, $117. And reminder that the bulk of the revenue for the non-res is coming from that new wind farm operation. And then the last one here is the farmland. So the tax burden increase based on the 4.72 option. In this case, I thought I'd phrase the change by per acre, because most farmers understand input cost per acre. So we're talking like 11 cents per year impact based on this and again, this is only municipal funding. This isn't factoring education change. So any questions on this?
Go ahead.
I think it's important to mention, Dennis, that when we look at the residential municipal tax rate, because I hear it quite often, people thinking farmers get a free ride. So every residence on every farm is actually the 3 acres that's the residence is taxed on that municipal rate. So you can't say that farmland only pays that top number, because every residence pays the same as an acreage owner on that 3 acres.
Correct. And through the chair, if I could just clarify that a little bit too. The site value is the same if the acreage was across the road from the farmer. However, the residence itself gets an exemption of a maximum exemption, $61,540. That means that is subtracted from the valuation of the house. So hypothetically, if the house is worth $100,000 and they had the maximum farmland to achieve that exemption, the house would only be taxed at roughly $39,000. But the 3 acre site would be, if they're both worth $200,000, the 3 acre site would be taxed at the same valuation. And the outbuildings on the farm property are most likely farm buildings. They're exempt, whereas the outbuildings on an acreage are most likely residential and they're assessed at market value. So just so you understand that differentiation.
And that's right. And because those outbuildings are used for agricultural production, and a portion of the house is used for agricultural production too, for bookkeeping and whatever else needs to be done on the farm, I believe is why it gets that $60,000.
Well, partly we don't allocate any farm use on the residents, even if they do bookkeeping or whatever in the house. The house is 100% residential class. That 61,000 stemmed from several years ago, and it's just been frozen at that value. It was I'm not sure, like it back in the day, like 20 plus years ago, actually even a little more than that. The assessed value used to be 65% of the market value. And then the exemption was actually 65% with what it is now. So I can't really definitively say where that 61,540, what that number represents. It's a legislative exemption that we apply. Yes. Yeah.
And what's the amount of land that you have to have for that exemption?
It depends on the type of farmland that you have. If you have good farmland on the west side of the county, like a quarter and a half would get, well, not even, a little over a quarter, because remember, a full quarter at 350 an acre, that's 58,000. If it's 95% of that, it's like, 55,000 roughly. So a quarter and a half will give you that on the west side. But if you go to the east side where it's pasture and that land might be assessed at 40%, you probably need about 3 to 4 quarters of land before you could get that exemption.
It's great to be a farmer.
So what does debenturing do for your, what were you talking about debenture for the total budget?
Yes, through the chair. So a question came up about or maybe I just brought it up myself. It was the debenture for the infrastructure that will service raw water to the Goldfinch ASP.
Oh, okay.
So that is a requirement to have that in the operating budget, and it kind of works on a cash basis almost. So council is required to include the requirement to raise money to pay off that debenture over time. So if, let's just say it's $1 million for the debenture on an annual basis, the budget must include a way to raise $1 million to pay off that debenture. So, and that can be done through, I believe the general consensus is that if the municipality is fronting some costs for hopefully some more development to come online over that time, if the municipality has a significant investment in like a development in the area, so our Goldfinch ASP is bound to see potentially like $200 million in 2026 coming on board. So that $200 million in investment in assessment, when that mill rate applied would be, using these numbers, maybe like 1.75 million. I can't do the number of just additional revenue. So that taxation revenue should be offsetting that debenture costs. And that's kind of when administration sits down and does that math and just kind of make sure that all kind of makes sense in like a break-even value almost.
Well, I'll be the first one to say that I don't want to definitely to go over the 3. So it'd be 3 or less for me. I think it works out quite well.
So you're talking the options then?
Yeah, the options. I don't know if you want to get into it now, but.
No, it's up to the committee what you want to do. I was going to suggest we could get a printout of page 31 with the options, because we have a printout of this, just so we don't have to look at our screens or whatever, we can digest it.
Sorry, which page? I didn't follow.
The one where we have the options, 2024 tax rate options 1 and 2.
Yeah, and if I may, through the chair, you have to realize that if the 3% option really is tied to the budget approval. So if you wanted to go to 3%, that means you have to change the budget numbers. Instead of the interim budget, you have to go frozen at the interim budget and not allow the additional 500,000 that you've passed motions for in some cases to increase that budget by 500,000. So now there is some latitude though, if you wanted to say only residential sees a 3% increase, then you got to shift that burden to who do you want to shift that difference to? Do you want to shift it to non-res? Do you want to shift it to farmland? Right now, we're sprinkling the option that we're recommending, just so I'll go back to that presentation. Well, actually, this one, let me go back.
I see what you're saying. So, but what we could do is the M&E is got a reduction. We could keep it the same. And that, I don't have it either. We could up one of the categories to bring up which wouldn't be very much. What's right here?
If I may, through the chair, non-residential and M&E has to be the same tax rate. So I have it back up on the screen here. This is the page, I think that is the page 31 of the tax rate options. I can definitely print this off if you would prefer to have that before we have any more discussion. Would that be your preference, or?
It's just a suggestion. The committee's kind of talking it with it now. It's good to give some information.
Through the chair, we have those printed off.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
The committee. And through the chair, to committee member Bigger's point, yes, and these are just options that administration is taking, and we're just saying, let's apply that same piece of the pie across each class.
Yeah.
So one of the main reasons that we do provide like this sheet, for example, to the committee is that we are very cognizant that when ratepayers get their tax bill in the mail and they open it up and they see like on cell or row 17 line or row I, which is the residential total, the resident doesn't necessarily take a look, oh, you know what, it was the municipal portion that was, 3%. They take a look at that overall bill and they might say, oh, wow, that's 7.37%. And that's something that council needs to be very aware of, even though that administration doesn't control the education portion. We cannot, like, it's an assessed value times a mill rate. That's a number that is set by the province, and administration has absolutely no say in that one. But we do understand when residents do get their tax bill, that when they see that total, it will fall back on the municipality, unfortunately. And that's just kind of what happens when you get those big changes in education values.
So we do education, housing, and what's the other requisitions?
So it is housing, I believe. I'd have to take a look at the exact section in the MGA, but I believe it is housing and education that are the two mill rates that we can disclose on a tax notice. The other ones, there's other.
What about the 911 dispatch?
That's technically not called a requisition, so we can't include that as a mill rate on the tax notice. And the other big one as well that the municipalities faced over the last number of years, which I think was a discussion point, an advocacy point from potentially RMA, was trying to include that RCMP funding one, because that is a brand new expense that the municipalities kind of had to eat over the last number of years. And that one's crept up to this like $900,000 from zero over the last, 5 years or so. One thing that council should kind of take a look at is, and this chart is like super interesting, the one on your screen. So when council is looking at row 14, row 14, column B is the 2019 tax year. And that's how much, per resident on the average basis that Wheatland was collecting. And then in G14 is how much now the municipality is collecting. So it's actually just this year, and it's not approved by council, of course, but this is the first year that we've actually exceeded those 2019 values. So, during the affordability crisis and the inflationary pressures, the municipalities actually lowered the tax bill, which has been great. Council provided great direction to administration with regards to, different programs in the municipality to cut those ones back, and understanding that, maybe there was some efficiencies to be found. It's just now that, back from 2019, this is the first year that we've kind of gone back past that 2019 tax value. So just something kind of for the committee to consider as you're kind of deliberating on these numbers.
Yeah, and through the chair, and to augment the CEO's comments, if you look at the impact that residential has from education funding, they've seen an increase every year. And mainly due to the way the equalization formula works, and because our assessments has been increasing other than the 2020 year, but for the most part, the increase in equalization has caused our distribution of the requisition amount for education to increase marginally each year. This year is probably the biggest impact from other years, but so that's where I think the public, even though we break out the taxes and show the education component, we need to have a good communication strategy so they're aware that if you choose to approve this option, the $173 increase, and again, this is excluding the wheatland housing, but that is a very small mill rate. It's probably under $10 for the average residential here. So it's not a very big impact. Even though there's a $173 increase, the municipality is only getting $52 of that. The province education, which we are just a collector, we get the requisition, we can collect the taxes based on our live assessment, but we send that to the province and then the province redistributes that. The other thing to make sure that you're also aware of is the province indicates that the education funding requisition, the change this year is going to impact about, it's actually on the next slide or a couple slides down, but it's about 30% of the overall funding model for education of the operational costs. And I think it's about 9-point-something billion increase this year alone based on the freezing the tax rate and the equalized assessments going up. Municipalities that see a bigger impact in their assessment, like Rocky View, City of Calgary, they're seeing a larger percent increase in their education requisition and associated taxes. And that's why you hear Calgary, Edmonton, and those municipalities on the news quite a bit. They're trying to advocate that the education funding should be removed from property tax. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened yet. So just so you understand that aspect of it. And if I, again, through the chair, just to reiterate some clarity for Councillor Bigger's comments, if you wanted to do 3%, then essentially you'd have to cut the budget back, or you'd have to say 3% would only be for a certain class of assessment and redistribute that shortfall to other classes of assessment.
Yeah, through the chair, I just wanted to supplement too. Another option is obviously the reserves, but the chart we showed before, the projected for 2024, it's dipping quite a bit, right? So I think one of the things that we're trying to establish too is keeping a sustainable reserves budget. I know we have.
It was dipping because of Mayorfield too, right? And now that's.
Yeah, I think it's gone below the 2019, right?
Yes, through the chair. Yeah, yes, that's correct. So, you know, it's a fine balancing act, that's for sure. Yeah, I don't know how much more I can augment that comment. Thank you.
So just a question in regards to the information that we can give out on the tax bill. There's very finite information that we can give out, but what about if there's a mailer in that tax bill? Are we allowed to say this is the breakout RCMP wise, or is that regulated too?
No, so the tax rate, or the tax notice is regulated under the Municipal Government Act, and that is very specific what you can and cannot include. However, we do include a tax insert every year, and that tax insert is, you know, just municipally prepared.
So you can identify those things in that mailer, it just cannot be on the tax bill.
That's correct.
Okay, so that's a good option to have. I think that would be something that we definitely got to utilize. And I think we have in the past with just the information going, here's a breakdown of what it is, you know, other than what you see. Because yes, assessments have gone up. And unfortunately, you know, I represent the higher side of the county that sees all the assessments go up and the values go up. So they're always, you know, they're always feeling it as location. So what does the committee want to do? We have heard a little bit from one councillor. Anyone else want to chip in? Go ahead.
I like what staff done spread it out equally. When I look at residential at almost 3 mils and farm rates at 3.5, we're approaching that 5-to-1 ratio. I think that's important to keep in mind because we can't go by it. So every year the farmland increases and the residential goes down, we're going to hit that 5. We can't vary from that. So that was passed a few years ago. I don't mind the increased spread over everything. Everybody's getting a little bit of a reduction except farmland is going up. But when I look at the sheet, the main driver of the income of your taxes is the education tax. And I'm thinking we make that known, and the RCMP is probably eating up the $52 increase on the municipal portion. So we're almost neutral. It's just the province share is what's driving our tax rate. I could support that. Is it pink or brown or the far right one anyway? Go ahead.
Through the chair, if I may, I just wanted to clarify and give a better understanding of that 5-to-1 cap ratio that you're alluding to. Unless I misheard it, do you think that applies to residential?
It's the difference between residential and non-res, isn't it not?
Actually, no, the difference, yeah, it's the difference between residential and non-residential. And so right now, it's not farmland though. It's, so we're at, like on this option, we'd be at 7.87 and the non-residential is 2.96. So we're like 2 point something factor difference. And the MGA has a stipulation that non-res cannot be more than 5 factor of residential tax rate.
Doesn't apply to farmland?
No, there's no correlation or stipulation on capping the difference between farmland and residential. The only, at this point in time, that legislation is clearly capping the tax differential or the factor between non-residential and farmland.
Through the chair, just if I may, just for the committee's information, the legislation on the maximum tax ratio is on in the Municipal Government Act 358.1, and all the kind of the definition is in there that committee member Kester kind of had alluded to.
But farmland is not part of that equation, correct?
Yes, that's correct. And even I'd have to go back and take a look at that one myself. It's an interesting one. And again, it's an interesting conversation because it really does only come up once a year.
For sure. Yeah.
And just when we pass the tax bylaw, it's something that we always have to consider.
And when you have a regulated rate on farmland that is so far removed from what actual land values are, that's why the mill rate is so high on there. So that would be kind of unfair to have that limit on there, I think, but.
Yeah, so through the chair, it's relatively interesting, just the assessment base, and it's hard to compare our municipality to others, just because of the makeup of our assessment. So a good example is, Mehill County, which is just north of us. They have a relatively high non-residential mill rate, and compared to ours it is, but I think their residential rate is lower than ours as well. I assume they fall within that 5-to-1 ratio, but yeah, it's different all over the place. There is no perfect answer, but what administration has done is we kind of just kept that piece of the pie the same for each class. Of course, administration is here at council's direction to change that aspect. So whatever council decides to do, it doesn't have to be decided on the 2nd. It's just something that, typically we've done in the past, but if council wants to debate those mill rates in that portion of that tax revenue, we just need clear direction after the budget's passed.
Perfect. Councilor Reichert.
I'm going to be the same place I'm always been at. The 3% is I think the way we should be going. I mean, there is so much pressure out there, day-to-day pressure, everything's going up. April 1st, there's going to be an increase in people's gas taxes, commuting into the city to do their jobs and all this kind of stuff. The Wheatland Housing requisition isn't in on this. And I've got no problems going after the taking down our reserve funds, because surrounding municipalities are always looking at them, and maybe we have to have this discussion what the perfect number is, but I have no problem at all dipping into the reserve funds to get this number. Anything more than 3%, I think is sending the wrong message. We are open for business. I think it's painful. I understand that. And, but I think it sends the optics out there, I think, is what the important thing is. So I'm leaning towards the 3%.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm leaning more towards administration's recommendation. When you look at the actual dollars per class, I just see that we've been holding it for such a long time. And those inflationary pressures on everybody, also, we're feeling it as well. We have increased costs of fuel and all of the inputs that we need to provide the same level of service in terms of asphalt, gravel, everything. When you look at just the municipal part of it without the education part of it, like, you can't keep taxes down forever. And I think 4.27-ish is still reasonable. It covers our budget. I think we've got a good ratio between between farm, residential, and non-res. I don't know. I just think that I want to be fair to people, but costs do increase, and we want to provide a certain level of service. It just costs money.
Thank you for your input. Anyone else?
The only reason I don't want to go higher than the 3 is that it comes out pretty even. Oh, can't find these. Where you at 3% and what it does to non-residential, it keeps it down. The only one that goes up a tiny bit would be farming, and your businesses still get it. Like, if you go to the 472, it goes right onto the businesses. It's an increase to them. I can't find the slide. I really think, we're so close to the budget at 3. It does show a balance that we're willing to keep our expenses down.
Question, kind of a tie here so far, which isn't fine. There's other options. But how much, if we went with option 1, would we draw the reserves down cash-wise? Is it on here?
So
You'd have to be an estimation.
yeah, we could do a projection.
That might be useful.
Okay, we can certainly come up with that.
Yeah.
It really does depend on how much capital work gets done.
It's just assuming that we keep all the capital projects the same.
Yeah, okay.
And then what would the drawdown be if that option's chosen?
Yep.
I guess it'd be good information. So it's cause and effect, right?
$500,000.
Well, yeah, I guess the easy answer, committee member Kester mentioned, it is a difference of $500,000. I think it was 508.
Yeah, or 510.
Yeah, roughly around there. So, and again, that is an estimate of all projects being done, all
Which
operating.
hasn't happened since we've been here.
No, and we'll never hit that target. And it's an interesting one because we have had supply chain issues, we've had staffing issues, we've had lots of different factors that kind of come into that. Sometimes it's contractor issues or scheduling a contractor, the bid's not going well and have to retender. So lots of kind of moving parts on it, but yeah, the difference between that and those two would be, I guess, yeah, Councillor Kester's, or committee member Kester's observation is the 508 or 510. And just through the chair as well. So when you are considering a 1% tax increase to all classes, it's about $300,000. So that's kind of one, kind of just other factor to kind of consider in your head. So if, you know, we're sitting at the 1.6, that's kind of where you come up with that 510.
Fair enough. Anyone else want to weigh in before we?
So
Go ahead.
I guess on this chart that's up on the screen there, so the total budget amount, 30,402,000, that's without the 500,000 extra that we are contemplating, the difference in the final versus the interim budget. So really, we should include that $500,000 in there and say that what we require is the 30,908,000, right? And then it would show a deficit, like we're short. We would be short if we had the final budget number and this tax rate. We wouldn't collect enough for that budget, would we?
So yes, that's correct. And that's why it's kind of the two documents work together, the tax rate bylaw and the other one. So General Manager Adamson kind of made that point as well, is that council does have that authority to further dip into reserves to get to have that budget, the overall taxation lower. That's not a problem. Council just needs to direct administration to do that at the council meeting. So either option works. It's just kind of the wish of council. Administration's option, I think, is kind of noted here, has been that 4.72. That's the tax or the tax revenue increase. And then at that point, even if council is satisfied with that, or if council only wants that other one, administration can definitely work the mill rate numbers to spread that across different classes. Ultimately, council can set this way, however, which way they'd like. It just needs to be just direction set. So again, when we go back to that, the order, and that's kind of why I mentioned that order earlier. It's the budget needs to be set first, and then the mill rates are set second. So how the revenue is generated could sway a lot, but it probably won't, just philosophically with council, and it probably wouldn't be wise to make significant changes. So yeah, it's just something to kind of consider.
Fair enough. I've talked to many residents about taxes and mill rates and reserves over the years, and I've consistently heard that our reserves are too high. I've heard that from a number of people, and they want to know what we have for. Now we have done some asset management work, which is fantastic, because that's definitely showing there's a need for it, and it's definitely a cause and effect. And rural municipalities run differently than urbans, and we see that all the time, where they run on a debt. And we have money in the bank, which is good to have. We also gives us options to borrow money if we need to and offset that cost over years. So we're in a unique situation where a lot of other municipalities aren't. But I have heard consistently over the years from many of my taxpayers that it's too much. So I don't have a problem dipping into reserves if we need to. I mean, one or two projects that don't come in on time will carry over to the next year, which we saw already in the budget from before. And we are still providing a really good level of service. I've heard that too from our residents. They're very happy with our snow removal and mind you, haven't had heavy snows, but we had good road maintenance and good projects. So, and we're being fiscally responsible. So I'm not weighing in yet. Go ahead.
Does this administration have a position on what an appropriate reserve amount would be? I mean, I sort of look at the future and I think I see about $50 million worth of projects that we want to do in terms of water and other things. So what would you say? And maybe you don't have an answer off the top of your head. I don't know.
Yes, so through the chair, I don't have an answer off the top of my head, but kind of just some general concepts to consider is that Wheatland County has a significant amount of road networks that need to be maintained and upkept. Sometimes we'll get new projects on the go. There is avenues to borrow money. We'll need to replace equipment. A good example right now is that, at the end of this year, our reserves will be at, I actually have the sheet here, as of December 31st. Our restricted reserves would be at 44 million and unrestricted would be at 24. So when we even take a look at that 44 million, like you can back out 9 right away for the Lakes of Muirfield, because that's funds that we've received through lot sales that have been restricted for that. We have fire capital as well, and that's stuff that, you won't necessarily see. However, the service will be there. So that's one that we provide the funding for other external associations and internal departments. So it's it's a large moving number. I think all of council has seen through our RMA presentations that there's a significant bridge liability out there, and Wheatland County has one of the higher bridge files in the province actually, and that would just come with area and installation of previous bridges that need to be kind of installed. So again, council has the authority to pass any budget they so choose, and also set the mill rates. That's part of council's job. Administration's job is just to advise what we think is the best option, and ultimately council. Well, yeah, I'll just reference it as council, not the committee. Council hears from your residents and your constituents, and ultimately it's a choice of council on how to, think of the future and, how will our future asset obligations be covered, but also listen to the residents and think, okay, like this is going to be impacting every single person that pays taxes in Wheatland County. So it, again, always comes down to that balancing act. A lot of people only hear from Wheatland once a year, and it's when they get their tax bills in the mail. So it's a tough decision for council, and I'll leave it at that. But
No, I agree, because I have a lot more residential hamlet people, and it affects them. Commuters, mine maybe is a total different area than, let's say, what on the west is. It's just different, but this is, I guess, my decision would be for my own ratepayers.
yes, of course, and when council does consider this decision at a council meeting, they do need to consider the municipality as a whole, for sure. The other thing I'll just mention that Dennis, through the chair, Dennis brought up the other options that administration just came up with, and it's just the budget number dollars. So what we did on the first slide was provide a range between 3, which was the approved interim budget, and then the 4.72, which is administration's recommendation. But we thought that we'd also provide council or the committee here today these other options that you could also consider. And that is a municipal tax increase of 3.5% or 4%. And ultimately, once council has approved that budget, then administration has a lot more firmer understanding of the amount of taxation that needs to be raised, and then the mill rate if council chooses to direct administration to change the piece of the pie that council is going to raise to fund the operation of the municipality for the upcoming year.
Go ahead.
We have 3,156 residents in the county, times $52.59 from this sheet, comes to $165,000, $166,000 increase on the residential share. And that pays 20% of the RCMP levy. And the rest of the tax increase is school requisitions. So in all honesty, what the county gets to put in their pocket from the 4.72 is less than what we had before. Because we got to pay the RCMP and we got to pay, which are provincially driven thing. So I think if we put a notice in the mail, I still lean on the 4.72. And I do not like spending reserves on operating, because eventually you'll run out of the reserves and you won't have anything to build anything in the future. And the reserve money was collected years ago for the future. And I don't think the people years ago contemplated spending extra tax dollars on reserve to lower the taxes. For me, I can't, that's a hard thing for me to swallow. And I know for a lot of ratepayers out there, they can't understand that, but I'm just one vote. And that's my reasons. We've limited our tax growth. Those charges, that increase is provincially driven.
So when we had these bigger projects like water, things on the west side, some of that, like, it is an initial outlay, but there is a return on investment that administration has provided. That is, the cash outlay is initial, but there will be some developer put money in that because it's a service that isn't there yet. There's offsite levies, there's things like that that haven't been, am I correct in saying that, haven't really been factored into that initial cost? So there'll be.
Could you just repeat that question?
So-
Sorry, I was just looking at
so-
something else.
No, if, say for west side servicing and things like that, we're looking at the hard cost up front, but there'll be some offsite levies and things like that that will be, the developer's going to have to contribute some of that cost back in, either through buying the product or whatever. It's not just an outright cost. It will come back at some point. We've costed those out, I think, in Goldfinch and things like that. We've looked at things where it's got a return on investment of 10 years or whatever, so there's an initial cost, but it comes back, so.
Yes, so through the chair. So the Goldfinch one administration, and there's no approved development permits in there. So, as well, no new approved development permits in there. So the water line itself, there would be a developer agreement to contribute that, on the proportional share of infrastructure used, but that itself wouldn't impact reserves because that would be like money that the county would borrow to install that infrastructure. So the reserve kind of conversation doesn't really impact that. But what I would say is that type of infrastructure investment will be should be recuperated over time through increased taxation, through an increased assessment in.
I was going to say an assessment too. Like,
Yeah.
I seen like the wind farm is a prime example. If we didn't have that assessment come in, we'd have a totally different look here. But there is stuff that's coming in the next 2 to 5 years that will continue to, like that video showed, you're going to have a bigger thing to spread it out over. So that's some stuff just for the committee to consider as well. Go ahead, Dennis.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, and just to maybe help understand what the option 2 impact is for residential class of assessment, because keep in mind vacant residential contributes to that funding as well. If you look at page 35 of the chart, or I actually have it on the screen here of the agenda, this option 2 does the calculation a little more precisely than what you had initially done, Councillor Kester, in the sense that 205,000 revenue would come from the residential class of assessment as a result of this option. So I just wanted to make sure that you understand it's not just the using the calculation based on the average assessment isn't quite as accurate as seeing what the actual calculation works out to be. You were close. It's 205,000 is what the revenue impact is by option 4, or sorry, option the 4.72%. And if you look at option 2 to 3%, that would be 133,000 tax revenue. So we're looking at about, on the residential class alone, what is that, 67 plus 5, 72,000 difference between option 1, which is 3%, funding your interim budget versus option 2A, which is funding your proposed final budget. Just to help clarify that, if I could, Mr. Chairman.
But the point is that we're not covering.
Is lunch here?
Yes, to the chair. Yes, it is. It's ready for the committee.
Do people break for lunch and digest this and come back somewhat fresh? Do we need 45 minutes, half hour? What does the committee want? 45 minutes. Okay. Back 12:45. Welcome back to the committee of the whole meeting for March 28, 2024. We left off at 2.23 2024 municipal tax revenue options presentation. Does the committee wish to discuss this further, or what does the committee want? I'm seeking your input. And silence. We've heard from some, basically I just had a tally here. Basically, kind of a draw on where the taxes would fall. One was 4.72%, and there was a 3%, and then there was some further options given on not a paper copy. So if we can give administration some clarity as to where we could hopefully compromise on something, or give them at least two options to work on, so when it comes back to council, we can have some general discussion. Go ahead.
So for me, I think we heard two of the opposite sides. We're going to have to find a common ground in the middle somewhere. So I guess if maybe if administration wanted to provide us, they'd said that they also had a middle ground for 4.0 and 4.5 maybe, or
Up on the screen right now, he has 2B and 3, and 2B is a 3.5, and 3 is a 4% across the board by looks of it. Yeah, both of them. If you want to speak to that a little further.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, just to clarify, in the agenda package, that's page 35. So you can see that option in front of you if you want to. That has the, as has been indicated by the Deputy Reeve, we did provide a 3.5% option and a 4% option. It's the same concept as we discussed on the 3 and 4.72. I guess the only thing I'd point out, it's on the screen here, at a 3.5% option, which is identified as 2B in the blue area, that would generate about 30.5 million of revenue. It's about 147,000 variation from the initial interim budget. So it doesn't get us to that 3.9 is what the proposed change for the interim budget is. And then, conversely, and then the respective tax impact is shown towards the top there. The residential then would see a $36 increase. As a whole, the residential category would fund about 152,000 additional tax dollars from last year. And on this option, the new wind farm would fund 903,000 of the 788 revenue from non-residential. So that because some of the other categories slid down a little bit in the linear side. And then we could go through the option 3, which is the 4% if you so desire.
Keep in mind the residential and no, there's two of them that have to stay the same, correct? Residential and non? There's two mill rates that have to stay the same.
No, just to clarify that discussion, the variance between the residential and non-res, there cannot be more than a 5-factor difference.
Gotcha.
So for just to make that clear, if hypothetically residential was at 2, non-res could not be more than 10 because that's a 5-factor. We're quite a bit under that. We're like at 2 point, like in any of these options, we're around the 2.2, 2.3 mark. So we're well within our legislative requirement. I guess just a little bit of history. In northern part of the province, and maybe even this area, but I know the northern part of the province, municipalities were really trying to push the tax burden on non-residential, and that's why this came about. Because non-residential doesn't, like, especially if you look at the oil company situation, they're not even voting members of the municipality, and yet they have no say in who approves these tax rates, and yet they already, even in this option, they would be funding about 76% of the pie. Well, we kept that 3% change evenly distributed amongst all categories of the to have the same sort of percentage of the pie as last year. And the 4% option does that same calculation. Yeah, well, they were, from my understanding, they were given, and sorry, through the chair, they were given, I think it was a 3 or 4 year time frame from when they brought in this legislation to get to at least that 5-to-1, and ideally to get under that. And I have to say that like when I go to the Canadian Property Tax Association seminar, there's a lot of agents there that work for oil companies, and most of them applaud us that we're being quite reasonable on our ratio. We're not anywhere near that 5. So I think, which is I want to extend that commentary to yourselves. That's good on you for trying to be, I guess, reasonable. And I think one of the pillars is the growth of non-residential. Well, any of these options really doesn't impact non-res as much, because we did get some growth, and we will have future growth coming in on that.
Okay. So staff are seeking direction still. There's 2 more options up here. Is there appetite for any of that? Go ahead.
I support the 4.72, but if we have to make a compromise, I could go to 4. I don't think I can go to 3.5.
Thank you for your input.
I guess I'd be the same.
4. Anyone else?
I still think the 3.5 covers enough of the budget. I mean, see, what worries me is when we get to the non-residential property tax, we are still putting more burden. Every time we lower the rate, we're putting more burden on them. As in 117 for this one, at 4.72 at a tax rate increase of 117 on $1 million. On a million assessment. I don't know.
Does administration need, is 2 options good to work with moving forward? I think we've narrowed down from 4.
Yeah, so through the chair, it's okay that the committee does not come to consensus.
Okay.
We'll probably try to prepare 2.
Okay.
And ultimately, we'll just wait for the decision of council for the budget deliberation. And once that budget's set, then we can maybe move forward at that point with the bylaw. And even if that bylaw doesn't happen on the 2nd, that's okay too. We can get some more information from council and their direction, and it doesn't have to be passed on the 2nd. It's nice to kind of, for administration, to rip the Band-Aid off on all the financial stuff on that one day. But we don't have to do it that way. We can wait for the direction of council, and more than happy to do that. So we'll prepare those 2 options. And
then one thing I guess to address was, these are all across the board rates. Is there preference to do something and break it up differently? Because there's some balancing to do there, or is it across the board fair to the committee? Hearing nothing, so I think that's the way to go forward.
Yeah, and one thing that the decision point that administration will wait for from council is having those operating and capital budgets set. And after that dollar value is set, then maybe that conversation can occur. Then if you want to change that portion of the pie up. But until the budget's set, then it might just be a lot of numbers, then we can kind of narrow it down into a little bit of a scope.
Okay, fair enough. Anyone want to, anything further before we move forward on the next item? Seeing none? Okay. Go ahead, Dennis, finish up.
Yeah, there's just one last slide, just to remind you, I guess, again, we talked a bit about this, but the education component, that mill rate, really, unfortunately, you have no adjustment on that. It's kind of an in and out calculation. And so we did a little historical just for education component here. For the current year, on an average residential, it would impact $121. You've already seen this. It's about a 12% increase. And the farmland would be, $1.10 increase, and the non-res is about 238. So this mill rate and the education component is clearly identified in the top right-hand corner of the tax notice. Plus, there's a further breakdown towards the center of the tax notice of that. Other than as was indicated, we do put an insert in with the tax notice, and we can definitely highlight the impact that education has had on the unfortunate tax burden for the average ratepayer.
Perfect.
So the education tax is listed separate though, right? On the tax, yeah.
That's one of the ones we can identify. There's only specific ones we can, but we can add a mailer to point the finger at the other ones. Just want to try to spin a positive on this. We are debating over a 1.73% range, which is actually a good problem to have for a council. I've talked to other municipalities, urbans, that are looking in the 2-digit range, like with a 2 in front of it, 20% range, that they're looking at increases in there, and that's not around, up in the mountains somewhere. So it's, we don't have, this isn't a hard, it's very minimal range, which is nice to be able to work in that range. So thank you to administration. Thank you to Dennis for that. Anything further? Okay, we'll move on to the next agenda item if we are prepared to do that. Another fun one, the electoral boundaries bylaw review.
Yes, good afternoon, committee. Brian from administration. Just following up on the committee of the whole meeting that we had on February 13th. Administration did take down all of the committee's questions and kind of summarize them up into this report for the committee to see. So there was a number of questions, which maybe I'll kind of go over all of them. I think we have a little bit of time. It shouldn't take too long. There was a question from a councillor about the potential split of a Hutterite colony and growth in that area. So on page 37 of your report, kind of summarizes everything. We have received an application for that split. And the overall, our comment is that although population growth may occur from that colony splitting and getting more area or more population into it, it wouldn't necessarily impact the number great enough to have that uneven amount again into that division. And that's something that we just would need to take into consideration as it goes forward. There's another comment about agriculture being a big part of the county and how do you successfully not have that in a division. Well, ideally, kind of in this report on, I think it kind of goes into, or it's on page 37, sorry. It is ideal to have a balance between like rural and urban, or rural and urban sections in a division, but sometimes that just can't occur. Lucky for us, we do have some urbans in all of them, although those urban areas might not be that big. I believe every division does have them. One division, which I think has been kind of identified as around the Lakes of Muirfield, that one will be shrinking from a lot of the agriculture, and that's just due to the population growth. So there was another question about the data sources and where they were drawn from. So we did pull them from our assessment data, and we kind of filtered it, the data set down to like residence counts, manufactured home, and multifamily, and like just the senior residents that we have in the county. And then there was a request from the committee to have a map with the approved area structure plans with different colors for the developments. So that has been revised on these new maps that we had administration hang up on the wall, which has been really good. So a lot of the ASPs aren't really facing significant residential growth. Probably the two most would be Lakes of Muirfield would be number one by quite a bit. And then the second one would be kind of the Speargrass Carsland area. So with that, that Division 5 that is home to the Lakes of Muirfield, that area is shrinking. And I think on most of our options, we actually have it. So it's a smaller divisional area to account for future growth. This bylaw is only good until the next one is passed. So I wouldn't think that it would need to be reviewed in 4 years from now. Sorry, it would be reviewed, but it would not, a new bylaw would not have to take place just because the residential growth wouldn't kind of exceed that 25% threshold. That's a commonly accepted number, not a legislative number. Just want to point that out as well. And then another one was if a councillor's residence was no longer, existing councillor's residence was no longer in the new boundary, how would that impact? Well, realistically, it doesn't, and it's just kind of the new boundary set at the new municipal election, which is in October 2025. So that wouldn't impact the existing representation of any constituent in the county. So we did print those maps off, and we kind of hung them up here. I think all of the committee would have seen them anyways as they either walked in or at lunch. That's not necessarily saying that anyone saw them in between now and then. But the questions that the committee did ask on the 13th, we did address those, and administration is looking just for some guidance on how to proceed with it. Not saying that it needs to be done today, but there, just for the committee's knowledge, is that there is, after the first reading is done, there is a 60-day window for a petition that administration does need to leave open. The overall changes of the boundaries themselves aren't super contentious, but we do want to provide residents an opportunity, the legislative requirement to leave open for that petition window. So if there are any questions from the committee, administration would be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Process-wise, we would do first reading of a bylaw, and then will we have to narrow down any of this, or would this just go out to the public for their input? Because the public wants to, at least the people I've talked to, want to have say in this.
So administration's intentions would be to hold first reading and then have some engagement with the public. And kind of our thought would be to have engagement at the open house, some in-person engagement with all of council, which is scheduled for middle of July. And we'd have online surveys. Obviously, all of council is available to be reached for any input that the constituents do have on any matter. So any input that we receive, council can debate it during the bylaw readings and those petition windows. So any valid point, obviously, and any point is welcome from administration's point. Administration's goal is to evenly distribute the representatives that are represented by each councillor, and that's the kind of the way we try to draw it up on these maps. Administration did mention, and we still do stick to the assumption that as administration did these options, we thought that option one was the most when we took a look at everything, we thought that this was the best option. Just on the lines are relatively straight, which is a big thing. You want to have those areas easily identified. Option two we thought was a good one as well. And as we got to the higher options, we were trying to just provide council or the committee options with, so it wasn't just one or two. And of course, administration is open to any other boundary adjustments that the committee would at least provide some guidance to administration that we could take to council at a future date. So ultimately, we just need some time or some guidance on the actual option. And we just have to, it is quite a bit of work because we do have to describe the boundaries in the bylaw itself. So it just takes some time to actually write those out because there is quite a few lines. All through the county is a county that is over 1 million acres. So it divided through 7 divisional councilors. So we just need to get those that information so we can start drafting up a bylaw for first reading. And maybe just to supplement the point as well, the reason that this is coming forward is not just a project that administration thought would be a fun one. It's just to evenly divide the constituents throughout the county for equal representation. So if there are any questions or comments or feedback, administration would be happy to hear it. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything, feedback for administration?
Are you looking for which one we prefer, just as a, yeah?
Yeah, just for guidance, so we can administration can prepare the first reading of the first bylaw, or the first reading for the bylaw that would come to council.
I prefer the first one.
Mine changes the least, but I would say the first one too.
So,
I'm good with either one or two.
one. Mr. Larson, one. So that's good to hear. For myself, I mentioned this last time, and I'd really like to see somewhere it was striped across the county. Because, I sit in this room and we have talks about different things, and it's always a balance of east versus west, and I don't want us to be like Rocky View in the future. I don't know if there's a way you could balance it where you have someone has a division rate from west to east, and has because it just would set up for success in the future for councillors, would end a lot of disparity, I think. It would give a councillor a good balance. So, and I'm saying this from my division because it's shrinking, and it very well could end up being like Rocky View, where one councillor is looking after a hamlet. That is a really hard place to put a councillor in the future because it's a totally different mindset looking after urban residents density than it is a farming community. And that's not going to change here. So how come, and I think if we could do that somehow now, we're looking at it. Is it feasible? I don't know, but I think it's worth merit. I don't know what the rest of my colleagues think, but it doesn't matter who you represent. It's across, you give a fair, you're getting a fair balance as a councillor, feedback from your residents.
So I disagree.
Okay, that's fine.
I feel that the further away you live from the people that you represent, you're getting into higher government, and we can see how far that goes. It hasn't really benefited a whole lot. When you live beside the people that you represent, you get to know them and they get to know you, and it's a better communication thing. Thanks.
But these maps that we're looking at, these eastern divisions are getting huge. Those people aren't living next door to but the smaller ones, like Division 5, a future councillor could live in Muirfield, and that's all it is. And homesteads or whatever. So that person they could walk around and see their residents. And one community hall, they could have a discussion. So it's a balance, right? I see what you're saying and I get it, but it kind of goes the opposite way too. So go ahead.
But what is this job? This job is to look at what is the best for the whole county. So, I'm in a relatively small area, but I have farmers in that area that are farming 18,000 acres in my area. So, it looks pretty small, but there's still big agricultural producers in the area. So, I don't think, like we sit here and we are told from day one that sure, we represent our division, but we're looking after the whole county. What is the best for the whole county? And I don't know how you change, but it has to be, I agree with Donna, the further away you get, if my people can't come out and talk to me, because we have we have the concerns of, like, we're grappling with what they grappled with at Balzac. In fact, there's going to be a small area with really high industrial use in it, which will be adding a massive amount to the tax assessment. But the reason it's that way is because of location. You can't change anything. I mean, people don't want to, you could do whatever you wanted to do. You can't get people to move to Gleason, right? It's that's that thing. So I agree with Donna that we have to be in the area, but we still have to look over what the whole county requires.
So I'm number one then. I think you got, but as long as the public has input, because I've been, they've asked, I've talked to a lot of people and they've asked, right? So.
Yes, for sure. And through the chair, administration's intention is to do some public engagement with this as well. The nice thing is that the boundaries here, although they may be shifting, they're not shifting considerably. So one thing I was kind of thinking about that we should do is kind of identify the number of houses that will actually be impacted by the divisional shift as well. That would be super easy based on the direction for the committee for us to kind of come up with now. As for the area, the land size, administration is very aware that Division 7 actually will become the biggest area-wise, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's more about shifting the constituents so that equal number of constituents are represented by the council. So that's our main goal. Area, it would be great if every division was the exact same size with the exact same amount of constituents, but just kind of the way, unfortunately, with the pressures of our west side and how they're growing with more residents, it's just not going to kind of come in that area and down to that perfect match.
And then for the maps going forward, we were putting them up today and looking at them. It'd be nice to have the colors of that instead of the yellow line, just actually have the colors, what it's going to look like. You know what I mean? So this, and then show like the original one and then different ones with the colors actually. So it gets a little confusing if you don't follow it all.
Yes, for sure. So through the chair, our intention is to kind of put some easels up at the open house. Okay. We can also hold additional open houses here at the county or in divisions or any areas that are impacted. We do want to, administration does want to hear back from ratepayers as well, because ultimately it is their divisional representation shifting. The representation will always be there. It's just the division. So
yeah. Go ahead. Oh, your mic, please.
On my division, Division 6, and I guess Division 2 is the same, our shared boundary is not on a road allowance, not on a road. So when you're looking at who's in your thing, I got to look up into the hills and see if I can find a road someplace. I know now, but even the residents there, they're not 100% sure. We could like bump it up onto the 564 on one and carry it straight through. Maybe if that would work out, that would be my only ask, is to have it on a road.
And so through the chair, that is actually one consideration that we had. So it was actually option 3, which is one item in that ISL presentation that they talk about is having the divisions split by either natural boundaries or main artery, like a provincial highway or a federal highway. So that was like one thing that we, in a perfect world, the division would be kind of split by the Rosebud River. That would be a great way to do it. But unfortunately, just that population and how it is dispersed through the county, we just couldn't make it work. So the best option we came up with on being split by main arteries is actually option 3. But we kind of run into the situation where we found that the boundaries were spreading kind of like vertically and horizontally instead of like area wise, where we're trying to clump them all together.
That's why I don't like 3.
Yeah. Yeah. So that we did want to provide that option to council though, or the committee to consider, just because we wanted the committee to understand all options that are available, and there's lots of options available to the committee. We're just trying to split them out based for representation.
Right.
Anything further to add from the committee? Well, we agreed on something. So. 2.25 Regional Growth Management Strategy Update. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Taylor Feltz here with the Planning and Development Services team with an update on the Regional Growth Management Strategy. Before I get started here, I do have some physical copies if anybody would prefer to flip through that. Thanks, Stephanie. Feel free to hold on to that after if you'd like.
Ooh, that's yours.
Is it?
Yeah.
All right, so first I'll provide a brief refresher on what the RGMS is, and then facilitate a discussion centered on the guiding principles of the strategy. So the RGMS was adopted in 2011, and it's a non-statutory technical tool that was created to guide and inform the creation of county plans. The reason we reviewed the MDP before the RGMS is because the MDP has more impacts on day-to-day applications, making it more relevant to applicants and developers. The purpose of the RGMS is to develop a regional level planning framework consisting of a vision, direction for growth, and supporting principles and policies which outline growth locations within the county in order to meet future residential, commercial, and industrial needs over the next 40 years. So in a nutshell, the strategy helps us answer the question, where should we grow? One of the big outputs or conclusions of the strategy when it was created was a future growth concept, which I have on the screen here, that categorized growth into 4 main areas. The growth nodes, which are in green, rural community nodes, which are in red, potential intermunicipal areas, and potential business, industrial, and commercial corridors. The overall strategy was predicated on the connection and integration of population and employment with land use, infrastructure and transportation, economic development, and community services. So the question, why are we reviewing the RGMS today? Since its adoption in 2011, the growth management strategy hasn't been updated. And since then, several legislative changes and higher order provincial plans have been introduced, such as the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan. Other important studies have been completed and published since then, including the Highway 1 Functional Study, which identifies the Highway 1 bypass of Strathmore and future freeway corridor requirements east of Calgary. Staff have also identified the opportunity to modernize the layout and the language of the document to make it more user-friendly. The census data on population demographics are out of date, as well as some of the maps, which you'll see in the physical copies there. And they don't reflect the current area structure plans or intermunicipal development areas. And ultimately, does the vision of the RGMS, which is comprised of principles, themes, and goals, still represent the needs and wants of the county today? So you may recall the last time the committee met to discuss the RGMS, and the conversation was largely focused on reviewing the strategy's theme areas and associated goals. Our objective today is to review the existing principles, confirm previous feedback provided by the committee, and seek input on the proposed principles that staff have suggested, which will help inform details of the plan and guide staff in making refinements to the growth management strategy. Establishing these overarching principles is important because it sets the tone and encapsulates the most important aspects regarding regional growth management in the county. This exercise is very similar to that which Council participated in back in 2021 when reviewing and updating the MDP. And this largely correlates with the previous feedback we received from the committee last time we met. So part of the intent behind updating the MDP was to better align the document with other county plans, which brings me to staff's recommendation here to incorporate the guiding principles of the MDP into the RGMS. The MDP principles are categorized into 6 broad themes, which I have up on the screen here. They include agriculture, environment, economic growth, responsible development, community development, and regional collaboration. Each of the theme areas included guiding principles. The principles under the agricultural theme include the protection of agricultural lands and supporting agricultural producers. Other principles include environmental protection, promoting economic opportunities. Under the theme of responsible development, the principles include growth within existing communities in appropriate areas and requiring responsible development practices. Under the theme of community development, the principles include identity and civic participation, recreation and active transportation, and complete communities. And lastly, under the regional collaboration theme, we have regional partnerships, regional economic growth, and regional culture. So now we wanted to review the feedback that the committee provided previously and show how that aligns with staff's suggestion today. So we've categorized the themes of the RGMS similarly to those of the MDP. Generally, the committee believed that the theme areas were still important and relevant, including on the screen here, protecting ag land, continuing to support and protect the natural environment, promoting development where infrastructure exists and future growth is planned. On the screen again here, some of the feedback we heard was focusing economic development near growth nodes and established area structure plans. And then using more general language and removing specific terms from the guiding principles, such as green infrastructure, smart growth, and conservation subdivision design. This is quite detailed for a guiding principle. All of the committee suggestions are accommodated within the current MDP principles that staff have proposed using in the RGMS. So in the next few slides here, I have the current RGMS principles paired with the overarching themes in the MDP. The overarching themes are in blue or brackets following the principles of the RGMS. You can see how the principles serve better as the MDP's principles, I should say, serve better as guiding principles, and how some of the current principles are overly specific at this level, making them more suitable as policy considerations for future growth in the RGMS document. For example, here, if you look at guiding principle number 10, it doesn't include the county's other industrial area structure plans. And number 11 there no longer aligns with other policies and regulatory documents like the MDP or the land use bylaw. So once again, up on the screen here, these are the guiding principles that staff are proposing to include in the RGMS to help complete the document. Once we have the committee's input on this suggestion and the guiding principles are confirmed, we'll start preparing the draft amendments for review. And that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you for the presentation. Any questions, comments, feedback?
I think you've got it exactly right, that it just needs to be more general, stated in more general terms and aligned with the MDP. I think that's exactly where it should go, and I think you're on the right track.
Anyone else? Yeah, I think it needs to be updated for sure. I remember when this was done. Yeah, I wish it was that price now. Anything else? This will be done internally?
Through the chair, yes. We're going to work internally with other departments to update some of the capacity numbers that and figures you'll see throughout the document. A lot of the demographic information will come from Statistics Canada and resources like that. We've started undertaking a bit of that work at the moment. It's just confirming we have these principles to help us reshape some of the policies where that detail should be.
That's excellent. Nobody else? Go ahead.
It's on. I guess when we first developed that, it was, no, thanks. It was to help us define growth areas. And I think it's still relevant. I look back at it and it says protecting agricultural land. It's just too bad all the highways and railways run through the best land in the county. It's hard. The few little acreages isn't much, but when you take the West Highway 1, that's a whole swath of some of the best land in the county. It's unfortunate, but I don't know any way around it. It's location, location, location is what matters. So, yeah, tweak it up some. And, yeah.
I know in the past we had talked about some of these, sorry, the term eludes me right now, the development areas, like homesteads and things like that, how relevant they are and if they're actually feasible. And we talked about maybe cleaning some of them up. Is that still on the table before we do some of this? Or is that even something we can do? I don't know, because there's some of those areas are very outdated and probably never will come to fruition. And I'm not saying any specific one. I'm just, there's a lot of them out there that are identified in here. And if there's a possibility of cleaning some of them up before we go forward.
Yeah, through the chair, over the past few years, staff have been rescinding what we'd call built out or developed subdivision or area structure plans that have come to fruition, or worked with the proponents of those area structure plans to remove them if they're not progressing. So that'll be part of the review process. You'll see in a lot of the diagrams and maps we have in the RGMS that we actually no longer have those area structure plans. So it'll be tidying that up.
Because what's the average life of an area structure plan? Is there a life on it, I guess? So in the future, if we get one that we approve, I guess we know how long.
Through the chair to the committee, they actually stay for the duration. It could go in forever. They can be built out and just become moot points, but for some of them that we have, they can't go beyond phase 1 because of servicing requirements. The issue we have is because they were developer paid by the landowner, and we have approached them to rescind them, telling them the MDP policies give them the same rights. They refuse to work with us to rescind them because they feel it gives them some protection and value for their land. So we can only work with the ones that, when they're paid by the landowner, we're reluctant just to rescind even though we have that right. The ones that the county did, like we're reviewing the Goldfinch one, working on some other policies, we will be updating that one. And then I know there's a couple other ASPs where there's community ones that need to be updated due to just demographic changes.
Okay. For me, I'm happy that we're reviewing all of them. And if we can clean some of them up, that's great. If we can't, we understand. So anything else from the committee? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we have one in camera.
Yes, to the chair, that's correct. Just one in camera regarding municipal utility service planning.
Okay. And then who needs to be in the room, I guess? You will decide admin wise.
Yeah, we can decide.
Yeah. Do we need to take a break to set up for that or?
No, administration's intention is just to host it in here.
Okay. Yeah. So do we need a motion to go on camera then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll move us into camera for agenda item. Municipal utility service planning, FOIP Act Section 25 disclosure, harmful to economic and other interest of a public body. Motion before us. Any discussion? Call the question. All in favor? That's carried.